Alright guys, Willem here back with a new video, and in this video I'll be talking about the second season of one of my all-time favorite reality TV shows, around 10 years after its initial airing, with that being the second season of The Genius, that season being titled Rule Breakers. A season that had very mixed reception amongst its release, typically looked at as the worst season of The Genius, though even then that's not really saying too much. Though it's always been a personal favorite of mine, where I can understand the criticisms for it, particularly in the fact that it probably has the weakest cast of the entire show, and it feeling like this big steamroll, with Sangmin really outplaying everyone for most of the season. I still personally loved it for its all-time great characters. I personally love Sangmin, I love Hongchul, Yoan, Junghoon. People like Jinho, Doohee, Huijong all have really great arcs across this season. You also have some underrated players like Yu Young and Jiwon, and really just a whole, again, it's still The Genius. It still continues the flashy editing and humor that you can expect from the show, but taking it to even further extremes to what we had seen in season 1. With this season in particular having some of my favorite flashback sequences in the entire show, while the games themselves got even more complex on this season. And while I will say it's still hit or miss, with the formula for the games themselves kind of being perfected in the following season, I do feel like this season just felt like a bigger, grander season than the first one in almost every single way. But I'll be obviously running through my thoughts like I did in my previous video, running through the season from beginning to end. Starting off with episode 1, where right away we see Bandage Man recruiting players one by one. And just in general, this is a very different style of opening to the previous season, with us getting to see all the players first. Us first getting introduced to Hongchul, who is obviously a really insane character here, obviously a big comedian in Korea, the biggest star on this season, one that was even promoted at the end of the previous season, and one that gets the moniker here of viewer's choice for #1 con man, which I don't even know what that means. But anyway, we then get introduced to Junghoon, who is this broadcaster who had also run for political office and lost, which kind of sums up his overall story on this season, him getting this kind of dodo edit despite these like very minor moments of greatness. We then get the introduction to Yoan, the world's most successful programmer and the rival to Jinho, obviously the winner of season 1, where he even mentions here that he joined the show just to prove that he's better than Jinho. Which, what do you know? We then get the reveal that Jinho is also back, and they really play up their rivalry, talking about how he doesn't want to get eliminated by Yoan. And all this is really weird that they brought back the winner of season 1 for season 2. And to go along with that, we also get the return of Sangmin, also from season 1, who again, obviously really dominates the season. This season really is Sangmin's season, though it is weird that, again, for the second season of the show, they decided to bring back 2 random returnees from season 1. Mind you, I'm happy that they did, considering they are 2 of the best characters in the show's history, and it obviously radically changes the Genius history had these 2 players not been back for this season. Though, again, it is still kind of a weird choice here. So, like, season 1 is the only season to not have any sort of returnee on it, which is a strange stat. But after that, we get the formal intro to the show, the players being shown given their invitations and have them saying the tagline, along with the title of Rule Breakers, which I do think is kind of an irrelevant title, where season 1 was obviously rules of the game, in a season that taught you the rules of the game. Season 3 was called Black Garnet, in a season with a twist based around Black Garnets. Season 4 is the grand final, this final season for the show. Season 2 is Rule Breakers, because that's just the name. I mean, there really isn't anything that actually breaks the rules on this season, so I do feel like the overall titling of this season does feel a bit lacking, considering its lack of connection to really anything. But either way, we see the players finally enter, with Hongchul obviously coming in first, only then be followed up by Yoon-sun, with them talking about how they're enemies already, with the reveal that she had actually gone on a blind date with him for another show previously, which is weird, especially considering, like, from my understand, Yoon-sun is not this big TV personality. She's just this woman that had won a quiz show, so again, it's kind of weird they have this sort of connection here. But this previous connection does lead to some fun banter between the 2 across the season, which is Hongchul just in general coming off as such a massive presence on the show, usually leading a lot of the group talks and usually having some really ridiculous things to say along the way. But obviously we have the rest of the players then coming in, with Huijong instantly being set up as a big player, with talk about how high his IQ is, which really this entire episode to me ends up being largely dictated by this downfall for Hee-jong, who gets really propped up early on this episode, all for it to crumble down on him by the end. And really it is the aspect of it that makes this one of my favorite episodes of the show. Without that, we get Yoan coming in, with him directly pointing at Jinho as he walks down the stairs, only for Jinho to slap his hand away. And again, this is a really fun dynamic between the 2, one that is kind of underwhelming that we never actually see them come to head at any point across their 2 Genius seasons together. But also, this is kind of a weird intro for Yoan, who throughout the rest of this season ends up coming off as this scrappy underdog sort of figure, though here he comes off as this kind of dick to Jinho, with him talking about how he begged the producers to let him on so he could put Jinho in his place. And again, it is weird to see him have this really cocky attitude here when the rest of his genius career is really him largely playing from the bottom. By the way, we then get the introduction of the rules for season, which are pretty much exactly the same as season 1, though there is the introduction of a new advantage to the game, that being the token of immortality, which kind of feels like a mix of a couple advantages we've seen on other shows. It is very similar to the hidden immunity idol from Survivor, and the fact that it is this advantage hidden within the set that the winners of each round will be given a clue to, which obviously leads to future episodes involving a lot of hunting for this token, which I understand is an aspect of the season that people don't like. They don't like how much focus there is around the token of immortality, though I do think it is something unique that really does add to the season in my mind, especially considering its great payoff at the end. So despite it being found like an idol, it actually probably has more power than what immunity idol has on Survivor, where the actual power of the token immortality is more similar to that of the Diamond Power Veto from Big Brother, this power that allows you to take yourself off the block and then pick your replacement. Again, a very powerful power in that light, where if you ever lose a main match or get picked for a main match, you can then nullify your nomination and pick exactly who goes up for you. Again, a powerful advantage through and through, though really the search for it does kind of go in the back burner for the first couple episodes here. But after that, we get introduced to the first main match of the season, that being Food Chain, a game where each player will be given one of 13 animal roles, with obviously the animals being placed on a food chain, with the higher animals being able to attack lower ones, though each animal has a different win condition. And obviously this is a very clear modification of your typical social deduction game, a game like Mafia or Werewolf or even Among Us, where each player is given a role, and part of the game is you having to figure out what the other people have and be able to play to satisfy your win condition. A very complex game, one much more complex than anything we had seen in season 1, the one that I've always personally liked. Now again, there's still some qualms here, and the fact that obviously there's a lot of randomness in who gets what role and the overall strength of each of these roles. I do feel like the snake in particular is extremely overpowered, where it's a role that you can't die, and anyone that attacks you instantly dies and you win the game if 9 or more are dead, which is almost always going to happen. So again, I do feel like that aspect is overpowered. But outside that, I just find it to be a very fun game to watch. Even from beyond just the scope of the genius, I think just in general, this is a fun game. One that is pretty easy to follow as well due to your previous knowledge of animals and knowing where they place on the food chain. But again, there's a lot of complexity to this game, where there are 4 habitats that you have 4 rounds to move between, where you can't be away from your main habitat for more than a round, which adds to some predictability in where certain people are going to be. You can also see other people's roles, where at the beginning of the game, you can pick one other person to see what role they are, which can inform your decisions as well. And all these roles here are very interconnected, where obviously we have the predators and the lion, croc, eagle, and hyena who can all kill prey, though we have something like the lion who must kill once every round, the croc and eagle have to kill every other round, while the hyena really only needs for the lion to be dead, adding this instant rivalry between the lion and hyena. While also we have roles like the rat and the crocodile bird, who essentially serve as partners to the lion and croc respectively, to where all they need is for their partners to survive. You have these 4 smaller prey animals that cannot die if they're in a room together, which essentially means that one of them will always win the game, as at one point they'll always be the only one left standing, which also makes it a lot more difficult for the predators, as the predators obviously need prey to eat. However, they get to a point where they're in a room with the only remaining lower prey, they're obviously screwed, as we do later see in this episode. With just in general, the overall balancing between predator and prey is something that is well handled here as well, where essentially it forces predators to be killed due to the fact that there's not enough prey for all the predators to all survive. Also, we have other random roles like the chameleon that can disguise itself, and the crow that really has no other objective other than to just pick the winner before the game. And through this, I think it adds a lot of complexity to the game. Again, there is a lot of different approaches to the game, a lot of different roles in this game that really make this really fun to follow from my mind, making this probably one of my favorite main matches in the history of the show. As for the actual events of the episode, we do finally get our first flash forward of the season, where here we see Huijong telling Yoon-sung that he's going to be spiteful, obviously implying this rivalry between the two, which again plays into his downfall, as immediately following this, we come back to the present where he talks about how he thinks he has an edge at this game. Now, a weird aspect about this season in particular is that because of the added complexity to these games, they do end up giving these players rehearsal rounds typically, along with like pamphlets that tell them the rules, which obviously is very different from season 1. But in general, I'm kind of mixed on this overall concept. I do think having these rehearsal rounds, while yes, it allows for the players to have more understanding about the games, it does also kind of harm the pacing of the show a bit, to where obviously we have these rounds that are being shown on the show that don't matter, and through that makes you question why they're even really here from a TV perspective. But we do get a funny little moment throughout this of Jung-hoon getting the others in the room to do rock, paper, scissors to determine who's going to get killed, only for time to run out before they finish and him getting killed himself, which, again, feels perfectly right for Jung-hoon. Either way, right away, we do see alliances forming, with Hongchul gathering people right in front of everyone else, him getting Huijong, Dahae, and Yu Young together, who are instantly looked at as a really powerful grouping there, and Young Kyul ends up joining the room later in the episode where he becomes part of their alliance because that's kind of his thing. Though this leads to Yoon Sung talking about how she wants to take out Hongchul first as the leader of that alliance, which is funny that Hongchul seems to be the initial target for the outsiders, though somehow along the way, Huijong ends up being targeted as well, which obviously we'll talk about what Huijong does later in the episode, but I do feel like there was a lot of protecting of Hongchul on this season, where it does feel like there are many points where Hongchul should have been very much in danger through his actions, though never seems to really pay the ramifications for those. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that there was production influence and that production saved Hongchul. However, I do feel like the players themselves seem to be saving Hongchul, wanting to keep him around, whether that be for the prosperity of the show and them thinking he makes good TV, or the fact that obviously he was the most popular person and didn't want to betray him. But anyway, it does feel like that did play a factor into things on this season. Though I will say also, just the general concept of the alliance in this game is somewhat misguided in a way. Now, I don't think it's entirely, in the sense that obviously you can peek at other players' cards, and through that, having an alliance will give you more information on what other players are, and through that, that is important. However, due to the varying number of different win conditions, and again, the fact that there are not enough prey for predators, if you have an alliance that's filled with predators, as we do see this alliance later have, it ends up leading to your alliance being really irrelevant, as again, there simply just isn't enough prey for you all to end up winning the game. But anyway, we do see the real game finally begin, where we instantly see Huijong picking the lion, to which he smirks, talking about how it's time to enjoy victory, and then being extremely confident. He literally comes out of the room and just openly says that he's already won, and tells everyone to get on his good side, which again, so glorious. That ends up leading to his loss, which I will say just in general, the lion, despite the fact that Huijong's so excited for it, and it does seem like a role that people actively wanted, it's actually not that good of a role, as again, it is a role where you die instantly if you don't have someone to eat. And while yes, technically you are at the top of the food chain, which means you can eat anybody, there still, again, isn't enough prey for you to be guaranteed to have people to eat during every round. That makes it much more dangerous to be playing as the lion, as just a single slip up can lead to your immediate loss there, unlike the other roles like a croc or an eagle that can survive at least one round without eating. But anyway, we then get some funny content from Ji-won wanting the snake, only for him to then get the rabbit and be instantly disappointed, instantly talking about how he got the worst one, which is ironic considering his later win. We then also get Hongchul leaving the room, just laughing at what he got, though the show technically keeps it a secret for now. But following this, we do see a counter-alliance finally forming against Hongchul's, where Yeowon tells Jinho that he wants to work with him so that Jinho can get second to him again, which again just plays into their weird dynamic there, though they end up pulling in Doohee and Yoon-sun, which ends up being a 4-person alliance, which essentially ends up forming this like non-broadcaster alliance, which obviously ends up being a major storyline later in the season. But obviously we see these two sides plotting on whose roles to look at on the other side, where we get a little funny moment of Ji-won talking about peeking at Huijong to Huijong, but this is also where we do see Sangmin trying to work with Jinho finally, to which Jinho just rejects him, saying that he betrays people, saying, "I don't need you," which really just shows you the target that was on Sangmin's back from the previous season, obviously building up this reputation as one that betrays their own group, and through that does have a tough time during this first round here, though Ozzy is able to recover from this pretty quickly. But we do also see Huijong kicking Sangmin out of the room, which leads to Sangmin talking about targeting Huijong now, and proceeds to go to Jinho and tells him that Huijong is the lion, trying to gain leverage to join his alliance, only for Jinho to reveal that he already knew that he was just testing Sangmin, which is a funny interaction. But anyway, we do see most of the roles here, with only Sangmin and Hongchul not being revealed, one being the chameleon and one being the snake, which plays into a later reveal, though we do see Jinho being the hyena and Yoon-sun being the rat, meaning that despite them being in alliance together, they have opposing win conditions, with Yoon-sun needing the lion alive while Jinho needs the lion dead. But this does lead to Huijong the lion telling Yoon-sun that they need to work together considering their win conditions, leading to Huijong once again talking about the game is already over, leading us to round 1, where we do get some fun interactions in some of the rooms from Jung-hoon really being left on the outs and not really understanding the rules, which we have this interaction of Young-kyo, which I will say Young-kyo kind of comes off as a dick across this season, where he just openly says that Jung-hoon is the weakest link and mocks him for not understanding why people would lie, and then he later even attacks Jung-hoon just to mock him. But also we have Yeowon and Doohee flicking bottle caps to decide who gets killed over the other, to which we get a reference to the Gura moment from the previous season. Though really the big moment here, and really one of my favorite sequences of the episode, is what happens in this room with both Jinho and Huijong, where Jinho instantly hides all of the stickers in order to stop Huijong from attacking him, which I will say, this entire concept of the stickers having to be physically placed on the person you want to kill does feel a bit weird for the genius. Obviously, genius being a more mental game, where really I feel like the attack method should have just been like saying it to the dealer in the room over literally having to physically place the sticker on them. But it does lead to some fun here, as we do see Jiwon working with Huijong and handing him a sticker, only for Jinho to run around the room while Jiwon also cowers in the back, which is just really funny. And this is all while Sangmin and Hongchul are laughing in the chairs at the end of the room. However, in Jinho's dash here, we do see him attacking Hongchul, who again is assumed to be the snake, leading to Extreme Ways playing, revealing that Hongchul is dead, meaning that he was actually the chameleon, giving us this flashback of Jinho and Sangmin agreeing to work together, to which Sangmin even says that I swear I'm the snake or my mother's a whore, which is a funny line, but obviously that ends up giving Jinho the information to know to attack Hongchul here, leading this fun little moment, even though it still leads to another chase sequence between Huijong and Jinho, where Huijong finally kills Jinho, leading to Huijong continuing to talk about how he's won the game. Now round 2 does end up being a bit more standard, though we do get a couple funny moments from Huijong killing Yeowon, telling him that he was a Jinho fan. Also we have Jung-hoon talking about how his only plan is to not be killed, only for Yu Young to then kill him. But then we get to round 3, where we really get the climax of the game here, where Huijong had told Yoon-sung exactly where to go so that he can kill her in round 3 here. Again, for her, it wouldn't matter, as either way, as long as Huijong wins, she wins, only for us to get the reveal that she didn't listen to him, and that she has gone to a different room, leaving Huijong in a room with Youngkul, Jiwon, and Sangmin, Sangmin being the snake who can't die, and Youngkul and Jiwon being two of the lower prey, meaning that they can't die while in the room together, meaning that Huijong is screwed. Being this big shocking reveal here, with him slowly realizing that Yoon-sung screwed him over and him keep on saying, oh my god, which is all really funny. And we do get a flashback between Jinho and Yoon-sung, with Yoon-sung agreeing to save Jinho by killing Huijong, as she doesn't want to betray the people that worked with her, which I will say is a pretty bad move from Yoon-sung, to where, while obviously she survives all this pretty much guarantees that Huijong is going to pick her for the death match. Which, while at this point, again, obviously it's not a guarantee that Huijong will be picked for the death match, Huijong's later actions make it much more apparent that is what's going to happen, as we do see Huijong and Yoon-sung have an argument, where, again, this is the scene that was obviously previously alluded to, where Huijong just openly says in front of everybody that he's going to pick Yoon-sung, which is really poor play from him. Again, it just makes it clear to everyone else exactly who he's going to target, which essentially means that if they pick Huijong, no one else has to worry about who's going in because they already know who he's going to pick. So again, I feel like that was suboptimal play there, but either way, we get to round 4, which is pretty short, though we do get a fun little interaction where Yu Young and Dahae are the two predators left in the game and both need to eat in this round. However, they're both in rooms with the two last remaining prey, meaning that it's essentially a race between the two on who can kill first, with Dahae killing Youngkul first, meaning that Yu Young ends up dying by the end of the round because by that point G1 is just automatically given immunity, which is a funny little situation there. But anyway, we get to see the winners playing out as expected, with Dahae, Jinho, G1, and Sangmin winning, but also we get to reveal that Jung-hoon has won as well, which comes out of complete left field, with it being revealed that Jung-hoon was the crow and got to pick a role that he thought was going to win, to which he picks the eagle for some reason, which I don't get why he picked the eagle. Like 100% the move is to pick the snake. The snake is pretty much a guaranteed win. Yeah, he picks the eagle, which kind of just lucks his way into a win, but again, that's Junghyun for you. But anyway, we have the winners deliberate on who to pick, which is where we get this fake out of them picking Hongchul, only for him to obviously pick Huijong, and Huijong obviously picks Youngsung, leading us to the death match. A new one here, that being Quattro, a game that I am very conflicted on, in the fact that it is an entirely luck-based game. Though to be fair, this version of it does have some social strategy aspects to it, but again, it's still very luck-dependent, but I kind of like it for the show. Like, again, if I'm playing Quattro, I would hate it. It's simply a game that is almost entirely dictated by luck. But I think adding these social strategy aspects and then also having it in this first round here that is very split down the middle, I think it does lead to an interesting dynamic here. In the sense of being one of my favorite death matches to watch, even though, again, it is not the most fair death match in the world. But again, it's a game where the deathmatch players need to have 4 cards of different colors, where the person to get that plus the highest sum ends up winning. Meanwhile, the other players that are not playing in the deathmatch are each given 3 cards, and the deathmatch players have to swap with each of the players at least once to eventually create their hand. And again, if there was no social strategy aspects to this game, this would be entirely luck. And I do think that would not be particularly fun to watch. I do think later versions of Quattro that we end up seeing are not as strong as this first iteration, where the other players are in the room, and through that adds more social strategy aspects to it, as we do later see both sides create signals that tell each other what cards they have. And again, I think that adds a lot of intrigue to this game. So otherwise, it feels very luck dependent, and even then, it is very luck dependent. As we do see as the game plays out, where again, it is this fun battle between the two sides, with Huijong and Yoonsung obviously getting good cards from those they were working with, but also getting bad cards from those they're not working with. So we do see Youngsung having the numbers advantage here through creating this really strong bond with Jaekyung, to where she ends up helping her by the end of the round. Though again, the culmination of this deathmatch is pretty humorous, where Huijong literally says that everything is not luck, and saying it is weak, only for him to then lose by 1 point, largely due to luck of him completing a Quattro, though ends up being given a low card by Dahe, due to that literally being the only blue card that one of his allies had, which in turn leads to him losing by 1 point to Yoonsun. Again, a pretty unlucky downfall. But again, all of this is just such great content for Huijong. I really just love his overall downfall across this episode, of him being so cocky at every opportunity, only for him to be proven wrong. And I do love on his way out, he even talks about how he's upset that he looked like an asshole and that he'll take this lesson to be more humble, which, to be fair, we do kind of see in season 3. But with that, obviously, we lose Huijong, who, again, I still love as a character on this season. I think his downfall is one of my favorite story arcs in the history of the show, especially one-episode story arcs. And he also ends up being an interesting character, considering the fact that he comes back for the following season. Which, despite him making it further into the season, I do feel like his season 2 run here is a lot more memorable to me. So it is his cockiness that really makes him stand out and propels this episode to being one of the best in the history of the show to me. But then we move on to episode 2, where we do get pretty standard opening conversation here. I mean, the only thing of note is really Yoonsung coming in last, which they end up playing what would later become her theme song, a song that plays almost every single time she gets focused. Though it's during this that we get a fun interaction with Hongchul, with him calling her a murderer, which Hongchul's very descriptive vocabulary across this season, with talking about the game as if it's life or death, is a really humorous aspect of his character here. But anyway, we do learn that the main match here is Seed Exchange, a game that has everyone being seated in a circle, to which they are all given a number at the very beginning of the game, and they need to create a straight of 5 numbers in a row. The one person will be given X, to which if the straight is completed while they are X, they will instantly be going to the death match. In each round, the number will go up by 1, which means that the placement of X will also be shifted every round. And this is a game that I've always personally liked. And to be fair, I do feel like a lot of that's because this plays out in the best possible way on this season, with there being so many close calls that don't end up going through. As I do think otherwise, it's probably a bit too easy of a game. I do think it is very easy to just get a sense of what everyone's numbers is and get together your 5 pretty quickly. As we do see, as early as round 3, this game could have been over. Though that is also what adds to a lot of intrigue with this game, is the fact that obviously because everyone has different numbers and everyone wants to be part of the 5, and also considering the fact that everyone's number gets shifted 1 every round, it does lead to a lot of shifting dynamics as well. In situations where players are playing self-interestedly, it does lead to a lot of conflict, as typically you would need someone that isn't going to be part of the win to end up switching to lead to your win. So I do think that is something that I do respect from this game. But Also, an interesting aspect of this game as well is that the person in the middle of the straight will be the only one to be given a clue to the token, but also given 10 garnets, which does seem very overpowered, though obviously, typically you would split those between people in your group anyway. But right away, we do get a lot of focus around Jinho, with him wanting to work with Hongchul, again, seemingly due to Hongchul's popularity, but also we do see him trying to work with Doohee, to which Doohee also talks about wanting to work with Jaekyung, with his reasoning for that being because she took his advice on what phone to buy, which is random. This leads to the flash forward for the episode, which has these relationships in conflict, with Doohee wanting to end the game while Jinho is X, but needs Jaekyung in order to do so, which I do think is pretty solid foreshadowing here, as while it is one that is a very integral moment for the events of the episode, it doesn't actually spoil that much, as it obviously doesn't directly lead into the outcome of the main match, though it does play into the outcome of the death match. And I do think that's an interesting dynamic that is rarely used with these flash forwards, and it essentially tricking you into why exactly it's important. But at the same time, again, I do think this flash forward was a bit spoilery, and obviously the fact that it does very much imply Hui Zhong's downfall, which I feel like the show didn't need to outwardly just tell us that that was going to be the case. But here we get to round one, which largely focuses around Sangmin's perspective of him getting to know the numbers around him learning about Junghoon and Jiwon. We even see Yu Young tell him that she's the number above him, only for Sangmin to instantly call her out for lying, to which she then admits it, which has Sangmin mocking Junghoon for actually believing her, and talks about how great his ability to figure out lies is, which is ironic considering he doesn't realize in this instance that Jiwon is lying to him. But this does lead to Yoon-sung telling Sangmin that she's number 11, which now makes him realize that Jiwon is lying about being number 11, leading to this fun back and forth between the two, where really a lot of this main match has this bickering between Sangmin and Jiwon, with Sangmin not believing Jiwon, and Jiwon being so adamant that he's telling the truth, even though he isn't. But anyway, through this, we do have Sangmin thinking that Jiwon must be X, and we do have Sangmin finding out that Yeowon is number 10, which again, it's during this scene that we literally have Jiwon storming into the room, still being upset at Sangmin. So again, really fun ramifications of that rivalry there. But at the same time here, we do see Yu Young creating a plot of her own to where she only needs one more number and ends up enlisting the help of Yeowon to recruit Jinho into her alliance, with Yeowon detailing a strategy here of not caring if he ends up winning the game, though only cares about not losing the game, which is an interesting philosophy for Yeowon, one that really emphasizes his overall game philosophy across the entire run of the Genius, to where that's really just the way that he plays the game. He plays the game in a way that he is constantly on the bottom. He constantly downplays his overall threat level, and through it doesn't actually care about winning any of the games, which he doesn't end up winning any of the games, but is able to still remain relatively safe for most of the game, showing him really excel at this long-term strategy that always made Yeowon one of the more interesting players across the Genius history to me, and just how differently he approaches the game for most people. By the way, no one ends up swapping here until round 3, where by this point Yu Young's alliance has everything figured out, though all they need is for Jiwon to switch, to finish the streak, only for this to be the point where it's finally revealed that Jiwon was actually number 10, meaning that during this round he's actually X, making it so obviously he doesn't want to switch here, as that would mean he is the instant loser, which leads to this funny moment of them trying to drag him over to the dealers, though obviously time runs out. We once again get to another point where in round 5, Jiwon could just switch to end the game, though he once again refuses, initially at least, to do so, with Sangmin being X at that point, as at that point Sangmin would pick him due to their feud, to which Junghoon does some decent work here and really forcing his hand, saying that Junghoon would be next anyway and he would pick Jiwon anyway, leading to Jiwon finally accepting, only for now Doohee to ruin the streak, making the streak 6 instead of 5, making the game extend even farther now. But really throughout a lot of this, we do see Hongchul being left out of most of the strategy talks here, being upset at how his relationship with Jinho has crumbled, leading to round 6, where now Yu Young realizes that they need Hongchul to win the game, whereby abandoning Junghoon, they can now win with Hongchul being part of their 5, only for Hongchul to refuse, because I guess he's upset with Jinho, which is dumb. I mean, really, again, it's obviously him trying to make good TV. I think that's really the main thing here, though he obviously promotes this as him not wanting to let Jinho win, which just makes for a really chaotic moment here, but again, really, really fun TV. But again, it is this that really prolongs the game even further. If it wasn't for this, again, this would probably be a more standard game here, but again, it plays out in one of the best possible ways. But either way, we get to round 7, where Jiwon finally admits to Sangmin that he was number 10, making Sangmin realize realized that Yeowon was lying the entire time, which is the point where we get the reveal that Yeowon was X at the beginning, and now realizing that the game can finish once again just by switching Jiwon and Yeowon, to which Yeowon ends up refusing here, causing this funny little moment of Sangmin in frustration, yelling out, "When are we going home?" and starts breakdancing in the middle of the room, which was really random. But we get to round 8, where we're finally at the point of the flash forward, where Jinho is now X, and Doohee and Yoonsung talk about being able to end it now, where all they need to do is swap with Jaekyung. However, in doing so, Jaekyung won't be included as part of the 5, which obviously upsets her and leads to her rejecting this plan, to which Doohee is so upset at how could she do this and that the game would have been over. And really, I do feel like Doohee comes off as really indignant throughout this sequence, with again it feeling like him just being upset at people trying to do things that are in their best interest but not in his. Anyway, we then get to round 10, where now Yoo-young is X, and through that Yoo-young's alliance now decides to move on without her by swapping her out with Sangmin, which would have ended the game here, though at the last second we have Jaekyung and Doohee switching, with Jaekyung now obviously doing it as a defensive move, and through that now creates a string of 8 people, which leads to Jinho calling Doohee a Huijong-like bastard, which is a pretty humorous line. But that takes us to round 11, where now Hongchul is X and openly says it, and we get Jiwon talking about how he wants to save Hongchul, only for his side to create a plan for them to win, and him instantly going through with that. However, we're at a point now where almost everyone is next to each other in order, and there actually is a way to cause 2 streaks to 5, which we see attempt to be executed here, where all it would need is for Sangmin and Hongchul to swap. However, in doing so, that would lead to them being the 2 people that automatically go into the death match, which leads to Sangmin freaking out over why would he do that. But while this is happening, we then see Jinho's side of things swap things up, to which we end the round with the game declared over, where Jinho had created this plan for his alliance to swap within each other, giving them the win, which is a pretty strong play there from Jinho, especially considering the fact he then is declared the main winner, with him also getting the clue and garnets as well. However, here Hongchul is now the loser, to which he obviously plays up his elimination pick, really taunting everyone, asking them to point to who they want to be sent in, and he then asks Yoonsung if she wants to play, only for her to then run away. We get him picking Jiwon, but then saying is not it. This all ends up leading to him eventually picking Jaekyung, with her being called an easy pick due to people seeming to think that she's clueless, and really does come out of nowhere here, where outside of the situation with Doohee, Jaekyung had barely been in the episode. Sort of pick here didn't really feel set up really at all, but anyway, we get to the death match, which ends up being a new game, that being Sun Moon Star, which has the players not playing in a death match, each picking a symbol, and the deathmatch players have to bet on what those players pick. Another game that's mixing in social strategy aspects with a different type of game, this time being a betting game, where a correct bet will give you 3 times that amount, which I think is a fine death match here. I mean, it is one that probably favors a bit too much to the social strategy aspects. I do think there's also some luck in terms of the betting order, though I think as a whole, it does feel like an improvement upon a lot of the death matches of the previous season, which were mostly lackluster. However, I think this formula is further improved in the following season, which we'll eventually talk about. But here we do get another aspect of this game being revealed, that being the fact that the other players can also bet on who they want to win the death match, which I kind of like this aspect of it as well. Obviously, one, it increases the garnet pool, which is always for the better in my mind, but even beyond that, it does add a lot more stakes for the players outside the game. It gives them a lot more reason to have agency in deciding who they're going to side with, and while in a way it does take away from those in the death match and makes things more so lenient on the social strategy aspect of things, I do think it makes it a more fascinating game in my mind. And here we do see a montage of everyone betting here, which might play a factor into down the road. But here we have Hongchul being extremely confident that he's going to win, telling Yoonkyul to bet all in on him, and we would see Jinho helping Hongchul here, telling him how many cards were left after he picked his, giving him a sense of who picked what. But at the same time, we do see a conversation between Doohee and Yoonsung, where they do talk about saving Jaekyung due to the fact that she's an ally of theirs. Either way, this leads to the start of the death match, which has a funny little moment of Junghyun being first and him being asked what he picked, and he says, similar to my image, to which Ji-won says a fading star. But also, we do get a really ominous comment here from Hongchul that Jaekyung just seems to not think much of, though very clearly Hongchul is taunting her with the reality here, saying, have you ever thought that those that you trusted are diving a dagger through you? Which is literally what happens here. But really the game plays out kind of as expected, where nothing seems to be that out of the norm, though Hongchul seems to be playing very aggressively here, continuously going all in on people like Youngkyo and Jinho, though again, those are people that he seemed pretty confident with to begin with. And towards the end of the game, we do also have Sangmin having lied to Jae-kyung, talking about Hongchul being a better ally for him. And really just in general, Hongchul is propped up as being better at gaining allies here, being a better social player, leading to him winning in pretty dominant fashion here, to which as Jae-kyung is leaving, we do get this sad music playing, only for us to on screen get the warning that there's a secret about the deathmatch that'll be revealed later. Feeling like a callback back to season 1 where there's a couple times there. But as she leaves, we have Ji-won saying that you only have yourself to blame, leading to this big reveal, this flashback to 1 hour earlier, back to the Doohee Yoo-sung conversation, where literally after they say that they want to save Jae-kyung due to her being their ally, we have Doohee talking about how annoyed he is at her for not listening to him and instead now wanting her out. Well, also we get Ji-won talking about being annoyed at her as he could have won the game if she had decided to switch, revealing that her deciding to not switch back in the main match has now cost her, with now everyone agreeing to help out Hongchul, even her closest allies in Yoon-sung and Doohee, as they all want to increase the Garnet pool, which is this pretty cutthroat move here, especially for someone like Yoon-sung, who is typically this pretty loyal player in the game, and for her to cut Jae-kyung here for the sake of adding more Garnets to the Garnet pool is a bit shocking, though at the same time, it's like, what was she really going to do if everyone else is on board anyway? But still, this adds to this further tragedy for Jae-kyung, her losing the game, but also does kind of show her being a pretty bad player, and the fact that literally everyone ganged up against her. But either way, let's talk about Jae-kyung, who, again, was a fine presence on the show. I mean, she seemed to be pretty affable. She seemed to also be a pretty self-interested player, so at least there's that, but it seemed like her self-interestedness ticked people the wrong way. Now, I will say at the end of the day, I don't really fault her too much for that, as I think most people when playing the game will try to be playing to win. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these people being upset at her for not following them is due to preconceived notions about her. Now, I've said in the past, I do think Jae-kyung is the worst player in the Genius history. And while, again, I think there are pros to her, particularly in her self-interestedness, I do still stand by that statement, largely because, again, it's very rare for literally everyone in a Genius game to be directly coming for you, especially early on in the game, to which she had here, and that along with the fact that she didn't seem to be that good at the strategizing during the main matches or really had much deathmatch potential either. I really just don't see much potential for her, but at the end of the day, like, I don't think she's even that bad, even though she is probably the worst Genius player. That's not really saying much, as I do feel like the Genius typically comprises of extremely competent players. So despite her being the worst, she's not even that bad. But now for episode 3, where here we do finally get the search for the token of immortality starting here with the reveal of Jinho's clues and him being the first to enter, which I will say, again, obviously production influence there, though he doesn't end up finding anything before people start to enter. And again, typical opening conversation here with Hongchul calling everyone in the game murderers for what they did to Jae-kyung and say that he was only the tool while everyone else killed her. And again, his overall vocabulary there is fun. But then we get to the reveal of the third main match, that being King Game, a game where they will elect a king in round 1 and then proceed to pass down the king roll round the round until everyone has had a turn, though also each round each player will choose the thumb or an index finger to point up, and the king will determine which players go to A and B, and if you're in the minority of what you chose in either of those sides, you get a point. However, people cannot change what fingers they use between the odd and even rounds, meaning that the even number kings have a lot more information. And overall, this is an interesting game here. One that I remember not liking when I first watched. I do think now I do start to like it a bit more. It obviously causes these two warring sides and leads to this bit of an information battle between the two and trying to outplay each other and having to play around what the other side chooses. And again, I do like that aspect of it. However, something I really don't like, and something that I don't understand why they even did that for this round, is the reveal that whoever has the lowest scores will automatically go into the death match, where they will not be the typical one loser and that person picking their opponent. Instead, whoever's at the bottom automatically goes in. And if there are more than 2 that are tied for the bottom, they will all go to the death match. And I really hate this. I don't know why they decided to do this. I feel like it takes away from the overall format of the Genius. Now, again, it doesn't play on the worst possible way, where we do only have 2 people going into the death match. It's not this like really ridiculous number, though. I do feel like this is overall just an unnecessary change to be added here, just one that I didn't particularly like. But this is another game that we do get a rehearsal for, one that is pretty boring with not much really happening there, though we do get a reveal after the fact that there's another addition to the game, that being the Token of Treason. An advantage that can be used through using garnets, where every time it's used, the overall cost will go up by 1. That will allow you to switch sides, obviously allowing players to not necessarily be screwed over by whoever is the king, and I do like this aspect of the game. It obviously adds a lot more complexity to it, though I also don't love the overall garnet rule here, where again, it very much just feels like them trying to squeeze out garnets from the players, them realizing that they probably gave them too many at the end of the following round. And it does lead to some interesting strategy down the road of intentionally using the Token of Treason just to increase the price of it. I do feel like that's an aspect of the match here that I didn't love, though I do understand the point of it, especially considering it increases the stakes of using it every time you do so. But we do get the flash forward for the episode, one that again very much felt similar to the Huijong one from earlier, of us seeing Yu Young leaving the room, being shocked that someone lied to her, which feels like an instance of them again clearly telling you that Yu Young's probably going to the death match, and that her side probably ends up losing, which again is not my favorite type of foreshadowing here. But with that, we do see two sides instantly form here, which strangely seems to be broken down almost through gender lines, which felt weird. Where we do get this alliance of all guys with Sangmin, Jinho, Hongchul, and Jiwon, and later adding in Junghyun. Well, all the women get together and also have Youngkyo and Yohwan on their side, with Doohee being the one that's playing the middle here, with him struggling with who to pick as he wants to work with both Jinho and Yohwan. Though I will say, optics of this were not great, where we do see the guy alliance blocking the door, not letting the women or Junghoon in, with Junghoon obviously being the oldest guy on the cast. Again, the optics there are not great. By the way, both sides do essentially create the same plan here of trying to get the points early, and we do see the actual election coming down to Jinho and Dahae, with Dahae winning the vote, essentially meaning that Doohee has sided with Dahae over Jinho, with the reveal that Yohwan had convinced him to side with the other side, saying that they're in a boat of trust, which is a ridiculous line. But it is after this that we do see Doohee going to the opposite side, where we see Jinho yelling at him for betraying their trust, and we see Sangmin saying that he's gonna cut his finger off, which was really over the top. And we get in confessional Doohee saying that this is just a game betrayal and didn't expect them to get so upset, which is so funny considering what happens during Doohee's boot round. Coming into the first round, we do see the proclaimed majority alliance seemingly not getting their way despite having the kingship, where Jinho uses the first Token of Treason to stop Dahae from getting any points, and we do constantly see this minority alliance using the Token of Treason to their advantage, which already comes off as very suspicious. And how are they getting all these points despite supposedly not having the numbers and not having the information from the other side? And that mixed in with obviously the flash forward and also the wide amount of focus on this assumed majority alliance here, it should have made it extremely clear that there was a rat amongst them. To which the foreshadow of this, we do end up seeing Doohee leaving the room while his alliance is talking, to which Youngkyo notices this and follows him, only to see Doohee sitting in a chair alone, which also just felt like very clear setup to the eventual reveal. But it is here where we do see Youngkyo trying to play both sides as well, because that's Youngkyo for you, leading to this red herring that Youngkyo is the mole, despite the fact that he comes back to his side and actually tells them the real information. Finally, we get another segment of Doohee sneaking out, to which Youngsun finally follows him, and now it's actually revealed that Doohee has been the mole the entire time, leading to this really funny reaction from Youngsung of her just being completely godsmacked there. And we obviously get the flashback sequence of it being revealed that Jinho and Sangmin yelling at him was all pretend, with them really hamming it up there, and we get these shots of Doohee running from room to room and throwing notes at them, and all that is really funny. Though this ends up leading to some pretty interesting play from Youngsung, and again her instant reaction here being to guarantee her own safety, where despite the rest of her alliance now entering the room and us getting the Yu Young moment of her arguing with Doohee, which obviously we saw beforehand, Yu Young, Yohwan, and Dahae are left out of the group, while somehow Youngsung convinces Doohee to keep her safe, and Youngkyo gets added in because that's just Youngkyo's thing. But we do get some humor from Yu Young, Yohwan, and Dahae kind of moping outside, with Yohwan getting upset, saying that he's fired up only for us to then cut to him begging and kneeling on the ground, which is this humorous portrayal of him. But due to how the points are laid out, with Yu Young and Dahe already in last, and now it being very easy to just block out anyone from getting any points, we do see the plan now turn to just guaranteeing that Yu Young and Dahe are the only two eligible to go in, with Ji-won being the final king and him being tempted to screw over the likes of Yoon-sung and Yo-won, though ends up not going through with it, and instead end up seeing Dahe and Yu Young go into elimination, which again, I don't love this overall format of them being forced to go into elimination because they're at the bottom. I wish it was the standard formula, as I do think that would have led to a lot more intrigue. But here instead we see two people getting ganged up on and being forced to elimination. Elimination that ends up being Gil Hap, a return of obviously this match that was used during the final of the previous season, and one that is not the greatest TV. I mean, it's a very iconic challenge, one that I do think is actually a good Genius challenge as like a game to play, but I don't think it's the greatest game to watch. And really both of them kind of suck at it too, which is also a factor here. On the fact that we do keep with the same rules as season 1, but obviously without the panel of people helping them, which through that it keeps the dumb rule of you can't answer consecutively, meaning that it's actually better if you don't answer and wait for the Gil, which is really stupid, as we literally just see both of them just waiting for the other one to call it. To even drag this out even more, we shockingly get a tie to where we have to literally do another round, which is just kind of boring. Again, not the most interesting death match in the world, though we do see Dahe getting one wrong, which leads to her eventual elimination. And Dahe is a big what if for me in the Genius history. I feel like she's a player that showed a lot of game acumen, one that seemed to always have people around her, one that seemed to have a decent strategic mind, though one that kind of just gets screwed over by the game format here and how the game played out being a way that allowed for her to be an easy person to throw in. Mind you, I think she probably would have been picked over Yu Young anyway due to Yu Young's other connections, but I think Dahe is a person that would have had a lot of potential had we seen her play again, though really personality-wise, she didn't really bring much to the table. I don't feel like I can even name a single like character moment with Dahe, but I still think she's one of the better one-time players to be booed within the first half of the game. Now for episode 4, where again we start off with another pretty standard opening conversation, though interestingly, this ends up being the first point that we do see Sang-min deciding to go after Jinho, which obviously coming into this having a massive target on his back being the former winner, though I think at this point, considering the fact that he had won the first 3 main matches and proceeds to win this one as well, I mean the target on his back just continues to get larger and larger. Though with that, I'll also say I do feel like Jinho actually plays this season debatably the best of his 3 seasons, despite the fact that this being the one that obviously he doesn't win. But I do think his first 4 rounds of this game are extremely impressive, with him consistently being in the know and him kind of running circles around most of the cast. Though I will also mention that this episode also ends up being the last time that Sang-min himself ends up being vulnerable, this being the last time he loses a death match on this season, which ends up kind of being these perfect bookends for the season of it starting with this Jinho dominance, and then once Jinho starts to fall, Sang-min really runs the game from that point forward. By the way, we do learn that the 4th main match here ends up being the Blackout game, a game that I really hate, a game that I just don't understand what production wanted from this game. I mean, visually, obviously it's cool. It's a game that takes place in the main room, that they shut off all the lights, and they are split up into 2 teams of 5, and a member from the opposite team has to determine whether someone crossed the line or not, which if they cross the line and are guessed to not have, they gain a point, while otherwise they are eliminated. And like, again, it's just kind of a boring game. Like, I get that there is complexity in the fact that you can obviously trick the other side into thinking that you crossed over. You can also work with the other side and give them information, which adds more betrayal in that light. But I just feel like this type of game is done much better in other styles of games. I mean, things like Kong's Dilemma is such a perfect way to do a team-based game. Well, this feels like a game that is more so for show than it is for practicality. It feels like it's a game that's done because it looked cool and it can lead to some funny moments with people doing things in the dark, more so than it actually being that complex of a game. And we even see it here play out very underwhelmingly. So first we do see the teams being drafted, which ends up being picked in an interesting way, where the team leaders end up being those who are voted to be the favorites to win, which Jinho instantly knows he's going to be picked and walks forward, which is kind of a humorous moment there, though the other captain ends up being Yoon-sung, where really Yoon-sung throughout the season seems to have this massive target on her back due to people thinking that she's going to be a really strong competitor, which is kind of a shame considering the fact that she's not that great. I mean, she's okay, but certainly not the best player in the game that the people in the game prop her up for. I do wonder how much of that is obviously played into gender stereotypes of them just assuming because she's a strong-willed woman that she must be this really cutthroat player when really she's anything but that. Again, a similar issue that I think Issei Kyungran faced in season 1 as well. By the way, even the pick here does lead to some funny moments, with Hong Chul being one of the last to be picked, to which he calls them all trash for not being picked, only for him to be happy when picked, saying that he's at least less trash. And we obviously have Jung Hoon being the last pick because he's Jung Hoon, to which he says he's embarrassed to have his kids see this. But either way, this is where we get to the flash forward, which is a better one here. Again, one that, despite the fact that we do have this big betrayal by the end of this game, they don't focus on that and instead focus on Jinho, talking about how this is the most upset he's been at anything in the Genius, which, again, I think this is a pretty solid one, a bit over the top from Jinho's perspective, the one that does completely misdirect you in thinking that Jinho's team probably either loses or that he could be in danger, when really it's him being upset at having to betray Youngkyo. By the way, we do get a rehearsal round to where Sangmin ends up guessing right away, and then creates a plan for his own team to then end the rehearsal right away, not giving the other team time to participate by having everyone cross, a plan that Youngkyo doesn't go through with him being the only person to not cross, being this big shocking moment, the one that obviously alludes to the later plot twist. But either way, here we get the real game starting, where we do get a humorous moment of Sangmin trying to hear footsteps through the chair, to which Jung Hoon even tests it himself, despite the fact there's no one there to hear the footsteps of. But following this, we get typical Sangmin content, with Sangmin saying that he's not happy with his team, that they don't have a plan, and he goes to the other side and tells them that he is willing to betray his team, being the typical Sangmin move here. Though before he's able to solidify this plan, Yoon Sung ends up finding him and pulls him out of the room, to which now Sangmin, knowing that his team must distrust him, decides to make himself a triple agent now, by now telling his team that he's going to be a double agent for the other team, and is going to give them fake information and through that allow his team to win. Which I will say is a decent recovery from Sangmin here. Though once the game actually starts, we see everything crumble around them, with it turning out that the other team didn't listen to their advice, with their entire team being eliminated by the third matchup, essentially putting Jinho's team in a position where they're essentially guaranteed to win, because if you only send one person over at a time, it guarantees that you'll at least get 1 point during one of those rounds, which is a really boring result here, which really plays into why I don't like this game, where it's extremely gameable if you have the advantage coming into round 2. But through that, Jinho's team is clearly the winner here, and instead we then focus more so on the campaigning of who's going to be picked for the elimination, where this is where we get the big reveal, where Yoon-sun is campaigning, talking about wanting to send in either Sangmin or Youngkyo, to where the other team says that there's good justification for Youngkyo, with Yoon-sun being confused, saying what justification for Youngkyo, flashing us back an hour earlier with the reveal that Youngkyo has been working for the other side the entire time, with him going against his team during the rehearsal to be able to talk to the other team, create a plan, with him having given signals throughout the previous round to tell him exactly what to do. And while good on Youngkyo for pulling this off, also bad on Youngkyo, as this is just a terrible plan to begin with, as obviously if this ever leaks, which it does, it obviously makes him the very clear pick for the death match, as we do later see. But even beyond that, his justification for doing so is because he wants to split up the broadcasters in Hongchul, Sangmin, and Jiwon, which at this point didn't seem to be fully a thing to begin with. But even beyond that, even if it was, this plan is reliant on the team with Hongchul on it to be wanting his own allies out of the game. And we do see Youngkyo getting really upset at the fact that the other team wants to put in Yoon-sung instead of Jiwon. This generally seeming like the most upset someone gets across the history of the Genius, where most of the time it comes off as a playful sort of upset, while this seemed to be like him genuinely angry that things aren't going his way here. But they do end up going through with his plan by sending in Jiwon, with the reveal that there was a deal to put him in, which makes it even more clear that Youngkyo was the one to probably flip here, with Doohee even later telling Yoon-sung about Youngkyo being the spy, who later goes back to her own team and tells Jiwon about this, leading to him picking Youngkyo, leading to the Jinho moment of him being upset at his team for abandoning Youngkyo in this situation, which it's like, who cares? Though the deathmatch here ends up being the return of Sun Moon Star, where Jinho wants to save Youngkyo for helping his team, with the two sides seeming to be pretty split here, with Jiwon's side, with the two sides seeming to be pretty split here, with the losing team obviously backing Jiwon, while the winning team ends up backing Youngkyo. However, we do end up seeing Yu Young and Hongchul, both obviously having good relationship with Jiwon, decide to turn their back on Youngkyo, to where we do get a somewhat boring death match to where, again, it never really felt in doubt that Youngkyo was going to lose here, especially considering how distrusted he was, especially after Hongchul just openly screws him over, which once again also just shows you how bad of a plan this is from Youngkyo, where it just further shows how little you can trust him in the game, which just makes it even more likely that you're going to want him out as you can't trust him. So obviously he gets eliminated here, but we do strangely end the episode with a flashback revealing that 2 hours earlier, Jinho and Doohee had found the safe that contains the token of immortality. Those still don't know how to open it, and we even follow it up in the beginning of the next episode where they still can't open it, which is funny. They try to hype this up as a big moment despite the fact that it really leads to nothing. Anyway, we do lose Youngkyo, who I've said in the past is probably just one of the sketchiest Genius players to ever play. Like, he's just the type of guy that if I'm playing the Genius with this guy, I don't know how anyone trusts this guy with how sleazy he seems to come off as. He's like the type of guy that just sneaks into rooms and somehow finds his way into these majority groups, and it's just so wishy-washy in how he plays the game, with him just latching on to whoever has power, that it makes perfect sense why he would be taken out in a situation like this. I just feel like in general he is a player that is so difficult to trust, and because I don't really ever expect him to do truly well. Now, he is a very self-interested player, and I'll give him credit for that, though at the same time he seems to have pretty misguided strategic thoughts and playing the game pretty aggressively at points where he really doesn't need to, and just I do look at him as a pretty bad player. Well, then we move on to episode 5, where again right away we see Jinho and Doohee being the first to enter and agree to share the token if they find it, though we also get more talk about how Jinho is a threat and he continues to be targeted, all while Sangmin tells him to point out the person he's targeting, to which he points to Yoon Sung, which it's funny considering she obviously goes home in this episode, but also it's like, why are you actually going through with this? Why are you actually deciding to point out someone you're targeting? But either way. Well, then we finally get introduced to the next main match, that being the 7 Commandments, a game that I am largely conflicted on. I do feel like there are interesting ideas here. However, I feel like the execution is one that really just allows for a majority alliance to just steamroll, but even beyond that, has some roles that are just extremely overpowered, which makes the overall balancing of the main match a bit wonky, especially just handing a certain player the eventual win. By the way, this game is played through having each player being distributed 4 chips, there being a range of 4 different colors, which will later correlate to points, though the way they do is affected by bills. So there are personal bills and global bills. Personal bills are these randomly drawn bills that each player will get, with again some of these being much better than others, while the global bills are bills that each player can submit, and through that create their own rules on how these bills end up affecting your total point score. However, obviously those bills need to be voted in by a majority vote, which obviously favors a majority alliance. However, they did add in a function that is able to counter that being the vetoes and signs. Signs meaning that the bill will just automatically get signed through, while a veto will obviously automatically block it. However, to utilize these, you need wild cards, which each player is only given 1 at the beginning of the game. But again, if there are multiple used in one round, it once again becomes a majority vote, which again just ends up benefiting the majority. But really the worst thing of all this is an additional rule in that there's a way to use signs and vetoes, with the ramification for that being to give up all your chips, which sounds bad initially, though considering the roles that we learn later on, it makes this really ridiculous where 2 specific roles are essentially able to just fully utilize signs and vetoes at every opportunity and are actually benefited from doing so. So again, I just feel like this is an interesting game on paper, where you would again assume that a lot of people have different varying interests, and there could be all this conflict over which bills get signed through. However, I feel like at the end of the day, the overall balancing of the personal bills in particular really just makes the main match come off as a bit disappointing. But either way, we would start the game with everyone being doled out a phone, where a messenger program has been installed that will handle everything related to the game, one that was made by Doohee, which was weird. The fact that they got Doohee to program an app for them here. Though again, obviously they say that he had no knowledge of what the game was going to be, and it's simply a program made for the voting system, but still, it does feel very strange. They got a little person in the game to build this system for them. Though the usage of the phones here does lead to kind of a fun little character moment of Yoan writing down all the chips and colors on a piece of paper, only for a dealer to tell him that, you could just take a picture, right? And the show really hams this up as a pretty big dodo moment for him. But beyond this, we do instantly see Sangmin, Jiwon, and Yu Young working together, with Sangmin and Jiwon talking about how close they are due to having very similar careers. Where this is where we do get a lot of talk around this celebrity versus non-celeb dynamic, a dynamic that really comes to head in the following episode, And really, even in this episode where it's talked about, it's not really a full-fledged thing. Though obviously the two people that are mainly on the outs here in Yoon-sun and Jin-ho are both people that are not part of this celebrity group. So it does kind of make it feel like this is more of a real thing than what it seemed to actually be throughout this round. Again, you do have the likes of Do-hee and Yo-hwan working with the celebrities at points, despite the fact that they weren't really included within that group. But either way, we obviously see Jin-ho being targeted here, with Do-hee seeming to flip on Jin-ho, which was kind of strange, like didn't really make much sense considering supposedly Jin-ho and Do-hee were pretty close outside the show, so I don't get why he was targeting him here. And also along with that, Do-hee also gets this like weird little editing trick in this episode where he has this gun on his shirt, and the editors really like to play with him pointing his gun at Jin-ho and later add these like gunshot effects that seem kind of dumb. But anyway, it's also here where we see Sangmin, despite the fact that he is targeting Jin-ho, but also we get a bit of foreshadowing through Sangmin telling Jin-ho his personal bill, to which he ends up saying that it's the best, right? Kind of setting up his obvious win for down the road, something that doesn't even get touched on the show until much later. Either way, here we do see Jin-ho trying to form a majority alliance, again getting the non-celeb players alongside Sangmin. However, a major stumbling block here is the fact that Yoon-sun's personal bill is directly opposed to Jin-ho's, leading to us seeing a lot of Yoon-sun's perspective of this, of Yoon-sun telling everyone else to turn down Jin-ho's plan. But also we find out that her bill is one that necessitates her finding someone else that can give away chips, which in doing so she'll be able to gain wild cards, which at that point obviously will just let her get her way in most opportunities. We do see her going to people one by one, trying to find out their bills, linked to this humorous subplot of Jung Hyung dropping his personal bill and Hong Chul picking it up, only for him to take a photo of it and give it back to Jung Hyung without him noticing that it was gone. To which Hong Chul ends up showing Yoon-sun Jung Hyun's bill as his own, which is fun dodo content for Jung Hyun, along with the fact that we also get him proposing the first bill of the game, only for everyone to immediately oppose it. And we get a couple humorous moments across this episode from the likes of Sangmin hiding his bill in his shoe. We get Hong Chul submitting a bill simply because he's bored, though that bill actually ends up passing, which passing a bill does activate Do-hee's ability of being able to discard a card when a bill passes. And here we do see him discarding Sangmin's chips, which right away makes you think that he's anti-Sangmin, that he's targeting Sangmin. However, obviously it's later revealed that it's the complete opposite. Though again, I did kind of like how they portrayed this though, and making it seem like Yoon-sun was getting her way when in reality it was anything but that. But finally, we also get a decent amount of content based around Yu-young, where Yu-young seems to be one of the strategic leaders of this round, with her seeming to organize these celebrities together, and this ends up really annoying the people that are not within that group, with Yoon-sun in particular being upset at being left out, to where this obviously felt like a lot of setup to this notion of people wanting to throw her into the death match had one of the people on the outs had won the challenge. Though again, another thing that doesn't fully work out that way. Anyway, here we do see Yoon-sun proposing a bill, one that directly goes against Do-hee, which actually leads to a pretty interesting strat from Yoon-sun here, and the fact that she is purposely proposing these really bad bills, hoping that people use their veto, and through that are wasting their wildcards, which will obviously allow her to utilize her wildcards more effectively once she is able to utilize her bill. Though again, the plan doesn't work out fully as expected, as while the show does portray it in this moment as everything had gone through smoothly for Yoon-sun, it turns out in reality that no wildcards were actually wasted during this round, with Do-hee seeming to just be in the majority group instead. Eventually, Young-sung does finally find the person she's been looking for, that person being Yo-hwan, who turns out to have a bill that he's able to give away as many chips as he wants. Though this obviously comes with a lot of hesitancy for Yo-hwan, where if Yo-hwan helps Yoon-sun in this situation, he's obviously worried that he's going to be picked for the death match if Yoon-sun doesn't win, and if one of the people in the majority end up losing. So again, it is a pretty precarious spot for Yo-hwan here, though he does end up going through with helping Yoon-sun. But it's also in this moment where we then cut back to Jin-ho, where he seems to create this master plan, realizing that if wild cards can be transferred between people but also exchanged for chips, this will allow for an infinite loop that will allow Jin-ho and his alliance to essentially all get a joint win of essentially infinite chips. However, before this plan can even get started, we do have the other side proposing a bill that will stop you from using signs or vetoes, to where we do see Yoon-sun using 3 wild cards here in order to stop this, only for the bill to pass anyway, leading to the big reveal for the episode. First up in the fact that we find out Sangmin's bill, that being the fact that he gets 50 points if he has no chips. A power that is really stupid, as again, this is just an auto win, as again, it's just so easy to get rid of your chips to where you'll have 50 chips, and again, almost no one else can get 50 chips throughout this game, where again, all you have to do is literally just use a veto or sign without a wild card, and through that, you're essentially just guaranteed to win. So again, that was just a stupid bill in my mind, but even beyond that, we also learn about G1's bill, that being the fact that his score is the total number of blue chips others have, meaning that his chips also don't matter, which means he's another person that can literally just use wildcards constantly without any ramification. And through that, again, it really just gives this majority alliance so much power, where for any bill that goes through, they have 2 automatic wildcards in their disposal because 2 of their roles aren't affected by it and are actually, again, in Sangman's case, benefited by it. But also, again, this is where we get to reveal that Doohy has been working with them the entire time. The fact that when he was getting rid of Sangman's chips, he was doing so to obviously help him towards his goal. And we also get to reveal that Doohy never had to use his wild card. And again, at this point, it just really felt like the likes of Yunsa and Jinho were just completely shut out with not much they could truly do here, with the other side just having much more powerful personal bills, but also obviously the numbers and more resources at their disposal. But anyway, with the game essentially won here for the people in the majority, we now get to talk about who are they going to send in, where obviously most people want to send in Jinho as the biggest threat in the game, and through the use of other personal skills, we get to talk about making green equals 0, which will allow Jinho and Yunsun to be tied for last place, where obviously they would send in Jinho. However, we get the results where it turns out that Jinho gets saved by a technicality, where it turns out that most people misunderstood Jinho's role, where they assumed that his personal bill doubled his chips, when in reality they instead make all of his chips worth 2, which ends up having him barely squeeze out and making it into the death match here. But again, Sangman obviously wins due to his dumb 50 chip bill there, while at the same time we do see Yu Young use her power to make her chips blue, keeping G1 out of the bottom as well, again just giving the celebrity so much power in this position. But with that, Yunsun is the clear loser here, to where Sangman does end up saving Yu Young here, who probably would have been Yunsun's pick, but we do get Yunsun really hamming up her decision here, which I did find kind of fun in how she really focuses on Hongchul and G1, with Hongchul telling her that he wants to give her death. All while G1 ends up making a deal to keep himself safe, giving her 5 garnets, leaving Yunsun to pick the only other person in consideration, that person being Yohwan, person that literally betrayed the other side to work with her, which I always found to be a strange choice here. Now, she does say that she picks Yohwan because he trusted Yu Young at the beginning of the round more than her, but it still seems really stupid for her to do this, especially when Yohwan's in a similar position to her of being not involved in this celebrity group. I do feel like overall this was a pretty misguided play here, especially considering how strong Yohwan would have been in 1v1 matches, as you could tell by his entire career. I feel like the correct choice is probably someone like a G1, but anyway, we get to the death match, which ends up being laser chess, a death match that is only used one time, and I can kind of see why. I mean, it's not entirely bad. It's obviously the strategy game of defending your king, and the way you do that is by moving around these other pieces and having to block the laser, with obviously the moment where your king is hit by a laser means that you've lost. And this is an interesting game on paper. I do think this is a cool visual, at least. However, I think in reality it doesn't really play out particularly well. I mean, there aren't that many interesting strats in how to approach this game in my mind, where even Yohwan's strategy, which ends up being a step beyond the initial basic concept, it still is not particularly interesting. Again, to me it does make a lot of sense of why they don't end up using this again, as I just don't feel like there are that many options on how to play this. But anyway, right away we do get a lot of players talking about how the starting player has the advantage as they can block off the other laser right away. However, we do see Yohwan not take that approach. Again, Yohwan being this player that typically thinks a step above most other players, particularly in 1v1 matches. And through that, we see him essentially doing a similar strat to the baseline. Again, the baseline strat that Yunsun ends up executing here, but ends up doing it with a different piece on the board, allowing for more versatility for his pieces, and also blocking her out completely, to where he ends up defeating Yunsun in a position where he would have won no matter which way she shot her laser. Which again, I thought all this was really impressive play from Yohwan, really being a step up in his gameplay, really showing his perpetuity for death matches. By the way, with that, we do lose Yunsun, who is a pretty big loss this season. I mean, she was a massive character on the season up to this point. Obviously, was a major character in that first episode with the downfall of Hui Zhang. And since then, it felt like she had a massive target on her back really the entire time. It felt like she was kind of this season's version of Kyungran, this strong, independent woman that people just seem to be intimidated by, and through that just assume that they're a threat. However, unlike Kyungran, who was able to build a lot of social connections while out there, it felt like Yoon-sun did struggle a bit with that. I mean, she did have connections to the likes of Yohwan, Doohee, and Jinho. However, you never really see her bonding too much with a lot of the other players on the board, a lot of the celebrities. And through that, I do think that definitely seemed to harm her overall positioning. But she did seem like a very intelligent player, one that was very self-interested. So again, it was fun to see her go into survival mode at points. But as a whole, again, she's still kind of a mediocre player in the grand scheme of things, but one that I do think demonstrated a level of potential there. But with that, we'll move on to episode 6, which for me personally is an all-time great episode, not just of The Genius, but of reality television as a whole. Like, this is an episode that has always stuck to my mind as having one of the most insane series of events over the course of a singular episode. And while a lot of it does focus around the token of immortality, and I can understand why people don't like that aspect of this season and why they don't feel like it's very genius-y, but I still feel like it adds this massive series of reveals that revolve around it. And when mixing that in with the downfall of Doohee, it really just leads to this having some of the best moments in the entire series in my mind, despite there obviously being these controversies around it. But with that, we do start off the episode with Sangmin and Jiwon being the first to enter, to which we do get a lot of talk about this supposed meetup between the non-celebrity players, where Jinho, Doohee, and Yohwan are supposedly close in the outside world and had met to the point where this does seem to further elevate this celebrity versus non-celeb rivalry, with again this episode being largely focused around that rivalry. Again, really being the only time across the season that it is seemingly truly split across those lines. Though really this does very much feel like Jinho's MO while playing the Genius, of having these connections outside of the actual game itself, where we saw that last season with his connection with Poong, where they had hung out in real life, and that seemed to first solidify their bond within the game. And it feels like he's doing a similar thing to Doohee on this season. But all this obviously leads to Sangmin talking about having to break up Jinho's alliance, which may play some major ramifications for moments down the road. But either way, this does lead us to the next main match, that being the Monopoly game. Another game that I think is very interesting on paper, though. One, I mean, it wasn't that focused on the episode, but even beyond that, it is one that just, again, favored the majority alliance, where a majority will obviously have increased chances of getting all the cards that they need to eventually pull off a win. And through that happening in this round, again, it makes a lot of sense why they did largely condense this game as a television product. By the way, again, the game itself does have each player being given cards that represent materials, and the first person to collect all the cards of that specific material end up winning. And while there are certain types of cards where there are 7 or 8 of them, the easiest way to win this game is through collecting all the bombs, where there's only 5 bombs in the game. However, if you don't win through utilizing the bombs, then the person with the most amount of bombs at the time the game is over ends up losing the game, which ends up being this interesting wrinkle there, obviously adding this danger to trying to go for this easier win. However, a very controversial aspect of this entire challenge is the announcement that in order to see your cards and trade your cards, you will need to present an ID, which essentially means that every player is given this ID that if they don't have the ID, they essentially can't play the game. And obviously this has major ramifications when we get towards the end of the episode. However, it also makes me question, like, why was this a rule to begin with? Like, why did they feel like this was a necessity of having this actual item of an ID card be this make or break for the entire game? Like, it just feels like a strange decision to me. It seemed to just kind of go over producers' heads and them thinking that obviously there's like no way people are going to lose their IDs. It shouldn't really matter. Or maybe they thought the concept of, okay, people could trade IDs and maybe that can lead to some intrigue. People pretending to have cards that they don't actually have. However, it doesn't really seem to add much outside of obviously this notion of losing your ID. But again, through that, it kind of makes this entire game feel like largely unfair. Again, like the fact that you lose this one specific item means you can't play the entire rest of the game just feels kind of stupid. So again, I just feel like the overall concept of you needing your ID, the trade card, just felt kind of dumb. But anyway, the main match does technically start. However, we end up getting almost no focus on it right away, as it's immediately sidelined by the culmination of the search for the token of immortality, where this is where we do get a flashback involving Sangmin to us seeing the clue that he got, which leads him to some pages within a map book, which he enlists the help of Jiwon in getting away with ripping them out, with them having numbers at the top of the page which correlate to the code for the safe that Obviously, we know where it's at, however, Sangmin at this point doesn't. Leading to this interesting talk with Sangmin and Yoan, where Yoan reveals that he knows the safe location, and he wants to make a deal for the clue to token immortality, which really comes out of left field of how does Yoan know about the safe's location, where we had only been shown Doohy and Jinho. However, this is where we get the flashback reveal that despite Yoan having never won a main match and had not gotten any clues for himself, he had been constantly on the hunt for this token. He had been making deals with people that had gotten the clues, and the show again tries to mock him a bit here, and the show saying that he threw tantrums at friends, also treasured the half hints he was given. Again, like all this just makes Yoan come off kind of pathetic, though again, like kind of impressive that he was able to find the safe despite the fact that he was never even given any clues to it. But through this, we obviously have Sangmin and Yoan now working together, with Yoan planning on showing him the safe. However, there continuously ends up being these awkward interactions through people constantly interrupting them, where they try to go to the room with the safe, only to find Jiwon and Yu-young already there, who clearly know something is off with them, which all leads to this ironic conversation of Sangmin talking about how the season 1 prize money wasn't enough, which is like, you get less than that at the end of this season. Anyway, they finally end up being in the room alone together, to where see them arguing over who ends up giving the other person info first, to where Yoan ends up relenting here, showing Sangmin the safe, only for Sangmin to tell him to block it up as he doesn't know the actual password yet, which is this humorous little moment there of Yoan just being pissed off and Sangmin getting one better on him. But finally, we do see Sangmin again working alongside Jiwon and showing him the safe's location, though in doing so, he accidentally ends up knocking something over, leading to Jinho coming running into the room. Well, it's getting a lot of talk about how Sangmin is sweating, but this leads to the players getting their cards for the Monopoly game. Again, who really cares at this point? But Sangmin ends up being the first to get his cards, but then immediately returns to the room, where we once again hear him knock over a bucket, and we end up seeing the likes of Jinho and Doohy dashing for the room. That was his sense of being an even further mess, with now everyone but Junghyun know about the safe, with him just sitting on his own, not seeming to care much about it. But it's also during this craziness that we do have this short little moment of Jinho noticing Doohy's ID on the table, which might come up again down the road, and directly plays into the flash forwards that we get across this episode of Doohy laying in the middle of the room, seemingly depressed at what had happened to him, which again, like, is a bit on the nose. Again, I don't particularly love these that are actual genuine flash forwards. However, I do feel like for this episode in particular, it kind of works, especially considering just how many little reveals there are even beyond that one. But it's following this where we do finally have Doohy and Jinho getting the combination and opening the safe, that obviously seeming like they're going to get the token of immortality, only for the reveal that it's gone. To which we cut the Sangmin in the other room, laughing, revealing that he had gotten it back when he was in the room with Jiwon, seeing him reading the instructions and smirking, which again might play a factor moving forward. But again, this great reveal here of Sangmin actually having the token of immortality the entire time, and it obviously couldn't have gone to a better person. Sangmin, someone that is obviously going to make a complete show of this, and does so. Though I will say also ends up greatly booting Sangmin's game in a way that I do feel like I kind of recontextualized Sangmin's game after this rewatch, where I feel like I always remembered Sangmin as this extremely dominant winner of this show, and one that was able to dominate in a very impressive manner. However, I do think it's like things like having the token of immortality and him getting just extremely lucky in certain role selections that does make me kind of question that at this point, where Sangmin is still obviously an all-time great character. There's no denying of that. However, I do think as a player, I do think it's the fact that he has the token of immortality here that gives him this leverage in the game where people are just kind of scared to go after him, and despite there being many plots down the road of people wanting to go after him, I do feel like it is this notion that he's just going to be safe anyway that kind of deters people from actually going for him, which does kind of lower my opinion of his overall game ability to a degree. I mean, not thinking of him as this like super dominant winner in the way that I used to, but probably more so in a case of someone like a Yule, in comparing this to Survivor, and someone that played a very, very impressive game that also has this bit of an asterisk next to their name due to a certain advantage that greatly benefited them. But either way, with that, we finally return to the main match, where Again, things go by pretty quick here, but we do end up seeing the Broadcaster Alliance coming together. Again, this alliance of all the celebrities, with again this being the round where they do seemingly genuinely work together, working against the likes of Jinho, Doohee, and Yohwan, with them being left out of their plans. However, right away, the broadcasters end up comparing notes to where they find out they have 4 of the 5 bombs inherently, which really just shows you again the benefit of having a majority alliance, where through having this majority alliance here, it really just makes it so easy for them to get most of the pieces that they want here. But to be honest, we do find out that the person with the last bomb ends up being Yohwan, which this is also where we do get a lot of talk about Yohwan's strategy of playing this lone wolf, strategy that he actually ends up executing pretty well here. And really just as a whole, like Yohwan plays this round pretty impressively considering the fact that he is playing largely by himself. I mean, he is able to make all these deals left and right to get extremely close to winning on one of the more difficult materials to collect for. And also the reason why he doesn't end up winning here is largely a fluky situation. The fact that Doohee didn't actually have access to his cards in a position where he only needed this last card from Doohee. I do feel like Yohwan actually plays this pretty well here, impressively well considering his position on the bottom. Well, following this, we finally get to another of the more major storylines of this episode, with us seeing that Doohee now can't find his ID, where we see him going around asking for ID, during which I will say I did find it funny how when Doohee does ask Jiwon about this, we do see Jiwon immediately check his pockets for it, which should have been a bit of a tell there, where we could later get the reveal that Jiwon has Doohee's ID, giving us a flashback to Yu Young and Jiwon having picked up Doohee's ID in the middle of all the chaos surrounding the Token of Immortality, and obviously have utilized his cards in order to benefit their majority alliance, putting them in an even stronger position in that light, especially when it's icing out people on the outside from getting access to Doohee's cards. But we do get this weird moment here of Jiwon deciding to actually give back the ID to Doohee, only for Doohee to storm into the room, telling them that he found it, for some reason lying to them about having found his ID, which I guess is to make him look a bit more dangerous in the game. But I don't know, this was just kind of strange. To make him look more useful in the game, but I found all this kind of strange. But this does lead to the notable scene from earlier of Doohee getting annoyed that he doesn't have his ID and gets on the ground and get this notable shot of him from ahead, which obviously this brings us to the overall like morality, if you will, of this situation. A situation that I don't really have any fault in how most people handle this. I mean, while the Broadcaster Alliance got a lot of hate for what happened here, especially Jiwon and Yu Young, I believe the audience was so upset at them to where they end up getting threats online and end up somewhat harming their careers, and it just seems kind of dumb. I mean, again, this was largely based around the game, and while they do later claim that it was a joke at first as well, again, it never really feels like anything too serious. Like, it really just feels like a situation of them utilizing the rules of the game and the fact that there are these IDs that determine who can trade cards with who and utilizing that to their advantage. Now again, I still think the ID concept is really stupid. However, that's not the fault of the players. Again, the players are playing within the rules that they are given. It's just that I feel like production made a bit of a misstep in that ruling. However, I'll also say that I always found Doohee's role in this episode to just be kind of weird, where he really obviously hams this up and playing this victim on the show, and while obviously he is, I do feel like also he does so a bit too much, where again, like, he gets like really insulted at the fact that people are betraying him in a situation where like he's literally betrayed people left and right in previous episodes. And while I get that you can point out that, oh, Doohee wasn't able to even play the game in comparison to the other people that Doohee had betrayed previously, I do feel like at the end of the day, for me, it is a bit rich the fact that Doohee is so upset in this situation when again he has done similar things to players in the past. By the way, the game does start to reach its end with Yu Young asking Yohwan for his bomb, to which the broadcasters are able to get it. But with their win pretty much guaranteed at this point, the talk now turns to who they give the win to, as at the end of the day, only 2 people can be immune in this game. Again, there can only be one sole winner due to the overall rules of the game, and through that, they can only save one other person. With there being talk at this point about Jiwon being the person to give immunity to, considering he's obviously going to be clearly picked by Doohee. However, this leads to some pretty impressive play from Sangmin, where we then cut to Sangmin talking to Doohee, making a deal with him, and having Doohee target Jinho. Again, a move that he had been talking about in the previous round as well. However, it really just makes no sense for Doohee to go after Jinho. Though we do have Sangmin convincing him that he's looked at as a threat because of Jinho and threat needs to take him out, which again, Doohee doesn't follow through this entirely, though it seemed like he was convinced in this moment at least. But this is where we get the reveal that Sangmin wants to do something special with his token of immortality, not wanting to use it in a simple way, and decides to use it by giving it to Doohee, wanting Doohee to utilize it, and through that be able to send in both Jinho and Yohwan into elimination against each other. Obviously, this matchup that Sangmin had been frothing over, but Doohee agrees to this deal, to which Sangmin ends up telling his alliance about this, and now in a token of gratitude, as again, under this deal, his entire alliance would be safe, his alliance decides to hand Sangmin the win, which again is pretty impressive play from Sangmin. As we obviously later find out, he knows that this plan's not going through. He knows that one of his alliance is going to be in danger. However, he's able to convince them all to give him immunity under the presumption that he is saving them, which he knows he isn't. But this does lead to an awkward conversation of Jiwon and Yu Young telling Doohee what happened and apologizing to him for it, which did seem like a genuine apology, especially from Jiwon's perspective. But after this apology, we do have Doohee agreeing to going through with this plan, where Sangmin does give him the token of immortality and ends up posing in a photo with him, which I will say, again, as much as I love Sangmin, and as much as I did say that the likes of Jiwon and Yu Young were doing these things under the context of the game, I feel like Sangmin is actually the one that to me comes off the most mean-spirited of the bunch, where this felt largely unnecessary to be taking a photo with him of them holding token immortality, obviously just being this kind of joke after the fact and how he's tricking Doohee into thinking he's about to be safe, which to me, again, this would have upset me a lot more than the likes of Jiwon and Yu Young. But either way, we have Sangmin ending the game to where he is declared the winner, while Doohee is obviously in last, which I will say this is also kind of a weird aspect of all this, where considering they had full control over Doohee's cards, if they really, really wanted to, they obviously could have just actually repaid the favor by not having Doohee in last. Though again, obviously everyone but Sangmin obviously assumed that Doohee was going to be safe due to token immortality, which kind of makes it feel a little bit better, though again, it does feel kind of funny that they actively put him in this position to begin with, despite wanting to save him. But through this, we do see Sangmin giving his immunity to Jiwon, once again upsetting Doohee in the fact that the person that betrayed him the most is now safe, which also is funny in the fact that this should have made it very clear to the opposing side that Doohee was not going to fall through his plan. The fact that he clearly was thinking about putting Jiwon in. But then we actually get to the opponent selection, which is one of my favorite sequences in the history of the show, where right away we have Doohee pretending to pick Jinho, to which he shakes his hand, only to say Yu Young, being this big reveal that obviously he is backstabbing the Broadcast Alliance, pulling off this really big move, and now also utilizing the token of immortality. We do get a lot of shocked faces around the room, with Sangmin seeming to laugh it off, talking about it as if he knew that this was a possibility, which again initially would make you question what was he thinking in this situation and putting all of his trust on Doohee. But again, we do have Doohee still really hamming this up about he couldn't overcome the hurt he felt by being left out and that he can't forgive Yu Young, which again just feels like him taking it a bit too seriously. And really just in general, I do feel like The Genius is a game that is largely lighthearted. I do feel like across the seasons you can only think of a couple situations where the players within it actually take the game super personally, and I do feel like this is one of the major instances in my mind where Doohee does seem to actually just be genuinely upset at all the events that ends up turning here. But with Doohee now having the token of immortality, he then ends up playing it on himself and ends up picking Hongchul as the replacement, fulfilling this massive move here and utilizing the other side's token of immortality in order to send in 2 members of the opposing side, which is this great move at first, until we do see Sangmin laughing in the background, telling them just wait for the reveal that the token of immortality is fake. To where we get shock from everyone, and now flashback to Sangmin having read the instructions to the token with the reveal that he was given 2. 1 real, 1 fake. Again, I've talked about this before with Forever US and production planting fake idols. I don't particularly like this on paper. Again, I think giving Sangmin 2 two tokens here. One that, again, like still looks very real, and there's no way for other people to be able to determine that one is real, one is fake. Again, it does feel largely unfair. However, it just makes for such great TV here. It is obviously largely unfair, and I don't like how much it feels like production is openly meddling with things, obviously just openly giving additional token to build trust with. However, again, like it is Sangmin here, and he does play this pretty perfectly from a TV standpoint of really hamming all this up and creating this massive plan just to really dunk on Doohee on his way out. But again, it did serve his game. Again, the fact that he was given immunity through it. But this really just leads to this being an all-time great scene of reality TV in my mind. Again, all these ups and downs across this scene of Doohee being the loser only to betray the broadcast alliance and use the token of immortality against them. And we get the shock from that majority alliance and the fact that they've been betrayed, only for it to turn out that Sangmin had betrayed him the entire time. Again, all this a really insane series of events. It does leave Doohee and Yu Young as the two going to a death match in this situation. A death match that ends up being Blackout Game for some reason, which is terrible. I mean, Blackout Game, again, as a main match, I already didn't like, but literally having it be the determining factor on who goes home is even more ridiculous. And again, does play out pretty similarly here, where we do have them being able to pick their teams, and we get some drama within the teams of people wanting to flip on each other, where you instantly see Jung Hyun agree to help out Yu Young and sabotage Doohee, only for Hong Chul to then rat out Jung Hyun to Doohee, with Hong Chul being the broadcaster that seemed to be most sympathetic towards Doohee here, which again could be him just recognizing what plays better for TV, but really just in general, it did seem like he was the broadcaster that did seem to try the most with the non-broadcasters, and through that had good relationships with really each of Doohee, Jinho, and Yohwan across the season. But from the opposite side, we do see Sangmin and Yohwan get in an argument over the token, to which Sangmin ends up telling him that you were always the enemy, causing Yohwan to agree to help out Doohee in this situation. However, really none of this actually matters, as the entire deathmatch comes down to one specific player and one specific relationship, that being Doohee's relationship to Jiwon, where obviously he had just backstabbed him in the main match. However, you get talk from Doohee talking about how he genuinely believes their apology and is banking on Jiwon to throw the game to him, which Jiwon ends up agreeing to. And we do have Doohee's team going first with this really great buildup of the music. This clearly being set up to be a major moment for the show, where we do have Jinho asking Jiwon if he's ready for a decision, which is where we get the reveal that Jiwon has pushed red, essentially eliminating all of Doohee's team in one singular shot, essentially eliminating Doohee from the game, leaving Jiwon with his hands over his head while Doohee's really pissed off. And again, another moment I think led to a lot of frustration from the audience, and how dare Jiwon backstab Doohee once again. But again, it makes sense when you really think about the fact that it's Doohee versus Yu Young. Yu Young, a person that is his number one ally in the game, essentially. This person that he has had a relationship with since the very beginning. So again, it makes no sense that he would cut Yu Young, the person that he executed this heist with, over the person that he openly betrayed by executing the heist to begin with. But again, this also further plays into Sangmin's storyline coming into the episode, going to take out one of Jinho's allies, with us even getting a flashback with Sangmin talking about how they need to get rid of Doohee, as he's the one that connects Jinho and Yohwan. So again, to me, this just further paints this negativity on Sangmin in a situation where it just seemed like he didn't really get any of it, and it mostly fell on Yu Young and Jiwon in situations where, again, like I don't feel like they did that much actively wrong, especially when you look at the context of how these situations end up occurring. But anyway, Doohee ends up getting eliminated here, which again, like straight up, Doohee gets a pretty sad exit here, with him talking about how he was betrayed from his own company that he started and had millions of won being taken from him. But this scene is strangely ended by kind of this weird little subplot of Doohee revealing that Jiwon had called him before the episode and had tried to pregame with him, which leads to Jiwon not remembering it, telling him that he was probably drunk at the time, which is all really humorous. And really throughout all this, I Shot the Sheriff is playing in the background, which again, all this was just a bit of a strange way to end this episode. But anyway, with that, let's talk about Doohee, who I think has an all-time great downfall in history reality television. I mean, everything that happens to Doohee across this episode is just fantastic TV. From him finally being able to open the safe only for it to be empty, to him having lost his ID in the shuffle to where he ends up being the automatic loser because of that. We have Ozzy Sangmin trying to save him with the token of immortality, only for that to all turn out to be a ruse. However, he himself had also backstabbed the broadcast alliance. by not going through what they wanted him to do either. And then he obviously ends up being backstabbed by G1 at the very end. Again, just so many things happen in this episode that it really is this truly insane series of events. And really beyond that, Doohie's was also pretty fun across the season. I did feel like Doohie played a pretty effective game in just playing the middle for a lot of the season, being able to bond with the celebs like a Hong Chul and a Sangman, while also being able to bond with the non-celebs like a Jinho, a Yowan, a Yoon Sung, and as obviously the main trader back at the King game. And really just in general, I feel like Doohie did play the game pretty well for while he was there, though again, I do feel like he takes things very personally, and that's something I didn't love about him, where he was so upset the fact that Jae Kyung wouldn't listen to him that he decides to just take her out of the game. And obviously he was very flippant on Jinho, where he was willing to take him out of the game for no reason. He felt so betrayed by all the sequences of this episode, where he was supposedly still very bitter even after the episode. And like, I feel like Doohie seems to be one of these players that took things the most personally out of the players of the Genius, where he does obviously feel like a bit of an anomaly because of that, though still is a solid player, was a pretty interesting character across this season, with obviously his downfall here being extremely glorious. But now for episode 7, which ends up being another one of the stronger episodes of the season in my eyes, feeling very reminiscent of Open Pass from season 1, though we do start off with Jinho and G1 entering first, talking about wanting to work together alongside Hong Chul, almost instantly feeling like the end of this broadcaster alliance, which again didn't really last that long, but even beyond that is also just kind of a humorous conversation considering what happens at the end of the episode. But here we do get a lot of talk about the ramifications of the Doohie boot, with Jinho talking about how Doohie's been crying every day for how hurt he was, and we get this awkward moment of talk about how Doohie said he was in love with Yu Young, and Yu Young seemingly being completely caught off guard here in a Billy Garcia style of way. But either way, Sangman is the last person to enter, where right before he does so, we do get talk about flushing the token of immortality, which ends up being a common trend for the next few rounds. But Sangman's entrance ends up being a humorous moment here of him having dyed his hair blonde, which looks kind of ridiculous. So here we also get a little humorous moment of Da Young, Yohwan's girlfriend, having supposedly called a lot of the rest of the cast to try to make deals for him, which is a funny plot thread. Also funny considering she later does appear during season 3. And it's also funny here considering the fact that supposedly the only person she didn't call was Jung-hoon, which leads to more Dodo content from him, including the lead up to the opening credits here with him reciting an inspirational quote, only for him to then forget what that quote was. Either way, this leads us into the main match, which ends up being God's Judgment. A game where we had to roll 2 dice and end up having to pick 2 numbers, where if the sum of the 2 rolls ends up equaling one of the 2 numbers you picked, you end up getting a point, which instantly seems impossible, where each player is given 1 die that is pretty traditional in it having 1 through 6, while the other one ends up containing only even or odd numbers, making it extremely improbable that you would pick the 2 correct numbers here, though very clearly you could tell that there must be a trick to this game. Again, similar to Open Pass in the previous season, which this game does very much feel like a modification of that style of a game that does feel very luck dependent at first. However, there's an easy way to game it, and God's Judgment should have been a very obvious one, to where everyone should have recognized the fact that there was a way to mix things up here, especially with the fact that these die also are weirdly designed, to where I do think it should have been obvious that they could have been mixed matched, though obviously that doesn't really get revealed until much later down the road. Though, like in Open Pass as well, we do have the ability to buy dice with garnets, which will obviously be better dice, which again, just in general, this definitely just feels like another version of Open Pass. And dare I say, I actually like this more than Open Pass. Now, again, if there was a situation where everyone had gamed the game here and everyone got these die that would auto win you the game, then yeah, that can be extremely disappointing. However, we didn't get that, because I do feel like this ended up making for just better TV all around. I feel like the fact that more people picked up on a lot more of the clues made this really interesting, and seeing them try to hide it from each other, and also us getting more of these reveals, again, I just think makes this a really fun episode. While in comparison to Open Pass, where again, Open Pass is probably a better game, where again, there's more things that can go on, mind you, it's also probably inherently more luck dependent. I do also feel like it's an episode that's almost solely revolved around that Jinho reveal, where outside of that, I feel like the episode's just kind of good. Where to me, I feel like this episode in particular is one of the all-time great episodes of the show. Anyway, we follow that up with a flash forward one that, again, thankfully doesn't really do much to spoil the later reveals. That does show us the humorous moment of Hung Chul doing extremely well and making funny noises while doing so, which obviously implies that there is a trick to the game that people figure out, though it's funny that they show Hung Chul here considering the fact that he is one of the people that performed the worst in the actual main match. But really, overall, I do like how this episode is structured here. We're getting, unlike Open Pass, where I do feel like with Open Pass, you largely see the perspective of the losing side and don't really get Jinho's perspective until the very end. I do feel like God's Judgment here really allowed for every perspective to be shown, but still saving the major reveals for the opportune times. Well, here we essentially see the cast breaking up into 3 different groups, the largest of which being the Jinho, Jiwon, and Hung Chul group who work together, despite the fact that they have the least to work with here. Though we see our first modification of the formula here, with Hung Chul realizing that if they exchange dice between each other, they can increase the chances of them getting it right from 16% to 27%, which is still really bad. But with that, we transition to Sangmin, who obviously does end up truly gaming the game, though right away we do see him buying multiple dice, these new dice having 3 specific numbers on them, obviously greatly increasing your chances from the OG ones, though still not to a significant degree. But really, Sangmin's content earlier on here obviously doesn't show these big discoveries that he ends up making, but instead more so focuses around Junghoon, with Junghoon wanting to work with Sangmin here, and Sangmin actually even giving him garnets to buy dice with. And we do get like little moments of foreshadowing of us seeing Sangmin messing around with the dice, knowing that there must be a trick to it, and continuously seeing Junghoon walking in on him, with Junghoon calling him like a kid in puberty. But probably the most blatant foreshadowing here ends up coming from Sangmin asking to borrow one of Junghoon's dice, to which we later see Sangmin returning that dice, with now this dice having a random assortment of numbers in it, with Sangmin calling it a special dice, clearly it being the leftovers of Sangmin's perfected dice that he's now created. But again, this gets mentioned on the show here, but never really brought up again, kind of being this nice bit of foreshadowing that doesn't feel overtly heavy-handed. Either way, we then get to the final group to talk about, that being Yeowon and Yu-young, who are working together, with them ending up buying dice as well, to where they end up finding out another aspect of this match in the fact that Yeowon notices that there is a magnet within these die, to where they end up sticking together, and they initially freak out thinking that they've discovered the trick of the game, only then find out that it doesn't really mean anything, as when you throw them, the dice end up breaking apart anyway, making this discovery largely useless and really just a red herring, as really the thought process should have been, why do these things have magnets in them? Why are they sticking together? Which is the main importance of this info that Yeowon never seems to truly pick up on until it's later discovered by Jinho, where we cut to Jinho having already realized that they can stick together, only for him to then find out that they can break apart, being the big reveal for the episode, and that being the true way to game this game is by breaking apart different die and combining them to create these different combinations. However, Jinho seems to figure this out not too far from when time is up, and through that doesn't have much time to really utilize this information to the best of his degree, especially when he's later interrupted by Hang Chul and Jiwon, who are confused over why Jinho's not telling them anything. Or really, they just seem to be completely aloof in this game up to this point, where really most of their content before this is them being told about the magnets from Yu-young, to where Jiwon searched the table for magnets, which led to this humorous confusion from the dealer. But anyway, we do have Jiwon telling Jinho about the magnets, to where Jinho obviously already knew, though we do have Sangmin being in the background pretending to be amazed, which is more of just Sangmin really hamming it up for the show. But really everything ends up breaking loose here once we get this moment of Sangmin and Hang Chul talking, to where in the middle of them walking across the set, Hang Chul accidentally breaks the dice apart, to which Sangmin pulls him away, telling him to be quiet, though obviously that doesn't last, as we see them catching Jinho working on his dice, to where really again, despite the fact that he got the second most amount of time to be working on the die here, he really ends up messing them up, where he really isn't able to find the right combination here. But with everyone now knowing that the dice can break apart, we obviously get this big scramble at the very end here, with Jiwon also messing up his dice, with him literally having a 0 on one side of his. But anyway, we finally get to the dice throwing, where they do end up revealing that by just spinning the original dice, you can already just get a dice of 3 and 4, which is nearly the optimal die to begin with. And Hangul ends up coming in here with pretty decent dice, and one only containing 3 and 4, and another one containing 3, 4, and 5, leading to obviously the humorous moment from earlier of Hangul freaking out every time he gets one right, yelling "lucky guy," and having this fun energy here. That this is probably one of my favorite moments from Hangul, probably being one of the most notable moments from him on this season. Where again, it's obviously just him hamming it up, but though it's again in an endearing way, where he ends up thanking Jinho for finding this out and calls him Mr. Traitor. We have him yelling out "Cha" whenever he rolls the dice and celebrates despite the fact that he gets it wrong one time. And again, all this is really, really fun. Such a great character moment there. That we follow that up with Yoan going up next, where Yoan didn't even bother trying to mix any of his dice. He literally just uses the preset ones and actually ends up getting a better score than Hangul, which is humorous. Then we get Jinho, who has one perfected die of just 6, though the other one is a bit all over the place, and he ends up scoring lower than Yoan. We then get to Junghyun, who essentially has the same die as Hangul, yet despite that gets 3 more points than him, getting extremely lucky in having the top score until obviously Sangmin's run. Then we get to Jiwon, who does start off pretty well, but it does end in disaster here, with him ending up rolling his 0 and him getting only 5 points. We then also get Yu Young, who ends up essentially having the second best pair of die, having dice with only 3s and 4s on it, meaning that there's only one specific scenario that she wouldn't get points for, yet despite that, she ends up being lower than Junghyun, only for us to finally get to Sangmin, where he instantly hams it up by saying he only needs 1 marker and puts it on 11, with this big build up in the music, only for the dealer to call him out saying you need to mark another one anyway. But obviously, as Sangmin begins, he rolls 11s over and over and over again, with us getting the reveal that his 2 dice both contain only one number, one being all 5s and the other one being all 6s, revealing that he is fully gamed the game in a way that no one else had, where now we get the flashback to the full timeline, where Jinho had found out about the dice breaking 30 minutes ago, only for Sangmin to actually have found out about it 75 minutes ago, which again, I think is a moment that is perfectly foreshadowed, there being so many moments that lead up to this, to make all this really make sense. But also, I kind of like how it's portrayed here as well, and the fact that obviously Jinho is part of the first of these major reveals for these style of games in Open Pass. I did like having him being the one to introduce this reveal on this version, only for him to then be outplayed by Sangmin down the road. This being Sangmin's Open Pass moment. Again, this is just being a really fun moment in my mind, along with Sangmin obviously just hamming up everything here, with him yelling yes when he wins. This is why the fact that it was obvious he was going to win, and then does his awkward fist pumping after he does so. Anyway, Sangmin wins here, and he does end up giving immunity to Junghyun as the person that helped him win, through him allowing him to borrow his dice. But with that, we have Jiwon as the loser, to which we have Jiwon picking Jinho, again playing off of the beginning of the episode that had them wanting to work together, though seemingly picks him due to the fact that he would be less embarrassed if he were to lose to Jinho than to anyone else, which obviously is this different approach to what we've seen in the past, where it did feel very much like Jinho could have been in danger numerous times in these last few rounds, though was typically kept out of it due to people being a bit worried about facing off against Jinho in a death match. And to be fair, Jiwon definitely should have been scared to face off against Jinho, especially when the death match is revealed to be Indian Hold'em, obviously a modification of Indian poker, being made more complex here, where instead of it being solely reliant on the values of your cards, it's now obviously being in relation to other revealed cards, meaning that obviously there's the aspect of wanting to get pairs or straight or really any of these other combinations that do make this slightly more complex, though realistically it kind of just plays out exactly the same. Though it is funny here that the entire chip count ends up being determined by garnets, so we're coming into this death match, Jinho literally has 0 garnets, alongside Junghyun and Yoan, where Yoan actually remains at 0 garnets really up until the finale, being a funny part of his storyline, while Jiwon only has 1, to which Jiwon actually wants to play with only 1 garnet's worth of chips, though Jinho obviously refuses to that, obviously realizing just how luck dependent it makes this game with the fewer amount of chips, and really just in general, Indian Hold'em and Indian poker are more luck-dependent versions of poker, considering the smaller scale of the entire game, though at the same time that obviously does allow for you to count cards, which can at times have the opposite effect. Though really, this entire deathmatch ends up being determined purely by luck, as we do right away start the game with the reveal that Jinho only has a 2, essentially the worst card he can essentially have for this hand, to where G1 decides to go all in. However, Jinho is surprised by this move, though decides to go all in himself, with the reveal that both of them had a 2, being this really humorous result for this deathmatch. The fact that right away in the first round of the game, they both go all in and end up in a tie, meaning that essentially the rest of the game is now determined entirely by luck, where there's no more betting to be had. There's simply cards that are dealt out, and whoever gets the better hand ends up winning. To where even the show says that it's going to be a game decided by the gods. And in humorous fashion, with the very next hand that we get, we see Jinho get a 6. And what do you know, G1 also gets a 6, leading to another freak out here, obviously another tie, which just has humorous reactions across the board, not just from just Jinho and G1, but also the other players watching in the other room. But obviously it all leads up to another tiebreaker, which this one goes a lot more solemnly for Jinho here, where G1 instantly gets a 10, essentially the best card that he can get outside of a pair, and after a lot of, and unsurprisingly, he doesn't get it, leading to Jinho finally losing, being obviously the first time that he's lost the game, which is built up as this really big emotional moment, with Jinho talking about how he's disappointed with his appearance on this season, which is humorous considering, again, like, I mean, on paper it makes sense considering this is his worst appearance placement wise. However, I actually think this is probably his best played season, and he is really the one running circles around most of this cast for the first 4 episodes, and while again it kind of crumbles for him in the last couple here, he really gets taken out here in a massive fluke. And just in general, I feel like Jinho impressed me more on season 2 than he did with season 1. But obviously with that, we do lose Jinho, who really from a character standpoint, I feel like he ended up being more of the same, still a fun, brutal presence, one that obviously had a massive target on his back, though still had some really solid strategic play across the game that still made him come off as pretty impressive here. Like, I really feel like Jinho, while he talks about being disappointed by his run on this season, really just did more to really solidify his legacy in my mind. So obviously just the concept of having the winner of season 1 coming back instantly for season 2 against a mostly newbie field is something that does feel very wonky to begin with, but still I did feel like this is a pretty solid run for him. With that, we move on to episode 8, which really at this point you can clearly tell the rest of the season is going to be this steamroll for Sangmin, with Sangmin obviously having the token of immortality, but even beyond that, it really just felt like the entire editing of the show was so reliant on Sangmin that it would have been a shock for him to not make it to the end, especially where he's coming into this round with 30 garnets in a position where everyone else outside of Yu Young has 0 or 1, which is just really sad. That disparity between garnets was that massive here. And it's funny to see Sangmin here wanting the garnets that he lent to Junghoon back, despite the fact that he has none on him at all. But also at least this fun moment for Sangmin of him being called a Super Saiyan and him coming into the room with them adding in the Super Saiyan effects around him, which is humorous. But obviously, there's a lot of talk here about teaming up against Sangmin, with this actually being a moment where it does feel like the group does solidify in this. It does feel like the rest of the cast does actually try to gang up on Sangmin here to try to get him to use the token, though it doesn't end up fully going through. But anyway, we get to the eventual main match, a main match that I've always personally liked, and that being the Minus Auction. Again, another auction game. We did have one in the previous season, though I do think this is a pretty fun modification of it, where here we will have an auction for all these random cubes with numbers on them, to where you can decide to purchase or decline. However, declining will have you using up one of your 9 chips that you're given out at the beginning, though taking a cube will have you also getting all the chips that were used during that round, with the total amount of chips that you have being subtracted from your score at the end of the game, making your chips pretty valuable over the course of this game. And this interesting dynamic here, as again, there's also another way to skip the bid here, in that being the usage of garnets, which obviously don't have any effect on the score, those still allow you to skip, which again is an interesting dynamic it adds here, though obviously it does greatly favor those with a lot of garnets, where obviously Sangmin with 30 garnets here has the luxury of being able to skip constantly with garnets while others simply don't. And through that, it does give him a massive advantage in this game, and him being able to take take these smaller numbers without the need of constantly having to buy these bigger numbers to get the resources that come with them, and through that puts him in a very strong position to win the game. Though to add to the intrigue of buying these random cubes, the fact that if you buy consecutive cubes, only the lowest score ends up counting, which furthers this interesting dynamic with this game, and it also adding a lot more stakes for certain players when certain cubes come up. But also there will be one cube that will be randomly hidden in the game, never going up for auction, which can obviously mess with these plans as well. Again, like overall, I think this is a really fun game. While again, I do feel like people with higher garnet counts have a massive advantage coming into it, I do feel like as a whole, it's just simply a fun game to watch. Fun to see the players interacting quite a bit here, and fun to see these different approaches that they all take to the game. Now for sake of it, let's mention the flash forward, which ends up being a pretty minuscule one of this moment of Sangmin trying to get Hongchul to take -28, which really doesn't do anything, which is fine. Again, like me personally, I would rather have a flash forward that doesn't spoil anything than one that does, though it also is one that just doesn't really mean much. But anyway, following this, we also get rehearsal, which is mostly a waste of time, as expected. Though we do get some humor from Jung-hyun saying that he's gonna wait before taking cubes, only to then literally take the first two. And we do have a humorous ending to the rehearsal here, with Yohwan deciding to just take all the cubes to give Sangmin less time to rehearse, with Yohwan claiming that he has nothing to lose here and that he's willing to go into the death match to flush Sangmin's token, which I'm sure that'll happen. By the way, we do have really the entire group just plotting against Sangmin pretty openly here, creating this plot to make sure that Sangmin will be picked for the death match by having a designated loser, and also having everyone else helping a specific player to beat Sangmin in the main match. A plan that, again, doesn't go through, though also one that I do kind of question. I mean, like, again, it is tough to think about them going all in on creating this plan, all to then still have to sacrifice one of their own by the end of it. Though at the same time, that really just comes down to the overpowered nature of the token of immortality, where, again, it's just an extremely powerful advantage here, one that by this point in the game, it really just makes it so unlikely that you're going to end up going home, just due to how hard it is to even flush it from the game, to where it's really reliant on everyone else risking their own games for the sake of getting rid of the token of immortality, which again is very rarely ever going to happen. But anyway, we do start the actual game itself, where Jung-hyun does the same thing in buying the first few cubes right away, leaving people confused as he's already going against the plan that they just created. But here we do see Sangmin going for extremely low numbers, and Yu Young also going for numbers in the teens, putting them in the stronger position to end up winning the game, all while we see Yohwan wanting to take -33 to soak up all the other chips, while everyone's passing on these bigger numbers, only for it to turn out that G1 has the exact same plan, leading to pretty humorous bickering between the two across this episode. It also, just in general, feels like a pretty misguided plan, especially to win the game. Now again, if you don't have that many garnets to begin with, it's kind of a necessity to go for a bigger number, as you're simply going to run out of materials to use. But it's a strategy I just feel like never is a winning one. I feel like more than likely there's always going to be a player that is able to go for these lower numbers, and I feel like you're always certainly going to need numbers lower than the 30s to end up actually winning the game. By the way, we obviously see Sangmin using his garnets to save his chips in the game, and through that, at least some humor with, again, Yohwan and Hongchul literally not having any. Though we do then see him attempt to make a deal with G1 so that he can get -6, only for Yohwan to mess up that plan and take it anyway, to which he later also takes -30, messing with G1's plan as well, leading to the two bickering and talking about taking each other to a death match, which again really just feels like this entire plan to target Sangmin is really just crumbling at this point. But coming into round 2, we do see G1 and Yohwan somewhat come to agreements on what cubes to take, with G1 wanting -34, wants to keep passing it around, turn more chips, and has to constantly give Yohwan garnets for him to continuously pass it up, only for him to then take it anyway, leading him having -95 already by the end of round 2, seeming to put Yohwan in this pretty damning position, though at the end of the day, again, Yohwan probably was trying to lose at this point, based on everything we were hearing. But anyway, we get to then round 3, where we see -35 coming up, which obviously Yohwan wants, though we then see now Yohwan having to pay off Hongchul to continuously pass on it, including us seeing Yohwan do this weird hopping while begging for him to not take it. But this leads to another humorous moment of Hongchul passing it up, only for Jung-hyun to take it instead, which just, again, felt like another pretty misguided moment from Jung-hyun, of him taking these high numbers for seemingly no reason. season. Again, he was pretty low on garnets and chips, so I do feel like he's in this position where he is Sangman's #1 ally at this point, and I do think Sangman would have been willing to use the garnets on him. He decides to just not do that. But with that, we continue to get more humor from people being a bit greedy and wanting to continue passing things around, though G1 decides to go against that finally and take -31 earlier than he could have. And then we get to the final round where we do see Sangman trying to convince Hung Chul to buy -28, the moment from earlier that, again, doesn't seem to really matter, but it does have Hung Chul denying this deal and deciding to work with Yoan instead, only for, again, another moment of Jung-hoon deciding to buy it in a completely unnecessary move, but a move that is done for an interesting reason, as it is done due to the fact that Jung-hoon realized that a lot of the remaining blocks are blocks that he needs, meaning that if he takes -28, he'll have control of the board to take all those remaining blocks, which mixing this in with the fact that we also get a flashback reveal here in the fact that Jung-hoon was actually working with Sangman the entire time and had been trying to protect him. It does add a bit more context to his decisions here, but is also, again, just kind of bad, where I do think for him, flushing the token of immortality was probably to his benefit in the sense that obviously Sangman doesn't eventually use it on him, but even beyond that, if Sangman were to have to use the token of immortality, like, he's probably not using it to put Jung-hoon in elimination. So I do feel like for Jung-hoon, like, this plan just seemed extremely misguided, and despite the fact that he gets all these remaining blocks that he needs, he still ends up being at the very bottom, and to be fair, part of that is because he kind of gets screwed over by the final block, and while the show tries to portray it a bit as him being screwed over by -19 being the missing block, in reality he would have lost anyway, as Yoan had a good amount of chips to where he was never in that much danger here. But surprisingly, though, we do end up getting joint winners for this game, which is pretty difficult to do, but we have Sangman and Yu Young both getting the same score, with Jung-hoon now going to the death match and having to pick his opponent, to where we do get him once again kind of hamming it up here, and him considering putting in G1, to which we even get this flashback segment of their relationship, though that doesn't go through, and instead he ends up picking Hung Chul, due to the fact that Hung Chul has 2 garnets while Yoan has 0, which really shows you the effectiveness of Yoan's strategy of minimizing his threat level through having less garnets here, where, again, like, this is obviously a very notable aspect of his run on this season, is the fact that he goes through this entire endgame stretch here with no garnets, which it does feel like that ends up being a major aspect of why he's not being picked to go into these death matches, considering how little of a threat he's looked at, considering the fact that he has 0 garnets, and also how little of a benefit it is to go against him in the death match, as again, you'll get 0 garnets out of it. Once again, feel like Yoan kind of playing the way that the producers never intended, which, to be fair, I mean, they do end up changing up the rules for Black Garnet in a way that seems to be a counter to this strategy, but it is interesting to see that strategy come to use in this season. Either way, we get to the death match, which ends up being the return of Same Picture Hunt, which is not the most riveting TV, and I do think it leads to a pretty boring match here, especially with a pretty faulty aspect of the game here, in the fact that the person with the most garnets coming into the match ends up starting 2 spots ahead of the other, which I just think is a dumb advantage to add here. It just feels largely unnecessary, especially for it to be 2 spots in particular. I can get one in the fact that obviously it's essentially just a more fair way of deciding who would get eliminated first, but again, we see this rule being really exploited here, where, again, to Jung-hoon's credit, he does recognize the fact that if he just picks the same letters over and over again, then Hung Chul won't have the opportunity to see the rest of the tiles, and through that will almost guaranteed lose here, which we do see him play off pretty effectively here, where, again, initially we do have it come off as this big dodo moment for Jung-hoon of him not remembering these pieces that he's already seen, though obviously you get the reveal that this is actually a pretty powerful strategy that does lead to Hung Chul losing here, which ends up, again, being pretty dragged out here and ends up being just kind of an anticlimactic way for him to go. With that, we do lose Hung Chul, who I still think is one of the greatest reality TV characters of all time. I mean, while he is very much hamming it up for the show, and obviously is this comedian that has his reputation to a hold, and I think most of his role on this season is him doing that, I do feel like it's still made for fantastic TV. Again, I just still find a lot of what he does on this season really humorous, just in the way he talks and the way he reacts to things. Now, at the end of the day, is he the best player in the world? Not really. I feel like he mostly just came up with pretty baseline strategies, never was really able to execute beyond that, though he seemed to be very good socially, to where he was well liked, and that seemed to be a major aspect of why he was kept around as long as he was, along with his probably popularity that people wanted to latch onto as well. But still, Hongchul to me, again, is a solid player, but one that him being booted around this spot does make perfect sense, considering I do feel like he's very clearly the weakest competitor of the bunch at this point. Well, then we move on to episode 9, which ends up probably being the worst episode of the season, debatably of the series. Straight up, I do feel like while I still love season 2, and it is the season I probably have the most reverence for, I do feel like this endgame stretch here is just kind of meh, with episode 5 being the epitome of that, this being a really lackluster episode in almost all fronts. But it all starts off with the reveal that we will be getting guests for this episode, those guests being some of the players from season 1, where we see them getting an invitation to play a game with the final 5, to where we get this very scripted sequence of them messaging each other. But again, the fact that season 1 players are coming into the game to play the game with the other players just feels like such a massive unfair advantage for Sangmin here, obviously being a player that played with them in the previous season, has these pre-game relationships with them. That really just gives him a very easy set of allies here, which again puts him in a good spot despite the fact that he has the entire house coming for him at this point, where we once again see the other players being brought in before Sangmin and all talking about having a common enemy, needing to get rid of Sangmin's token, which they're all obviously not able to execute on. By the way, we do see the season 1 players finally arriving, to which Sangmin tries to act surprised, which again, there's no way they didn't talk before the filming of this episode. But again, we see the return of Jungmoon, of Changyap, Yuram, of Junsuk, all of these being kind of random picks. I mean, kind of lesser figures from season 1 in my mind. However, then we see Sungyu enter, which was a nice person to see back here. Obviously, his last appearance on the show, considering he doesn't return for grand final. But we do have Sangmin freaking out and running up to hug him, which is humorous. But then we get talk about how there's one player left, someone scarier than Jinho, to which we get talk about how it's Gura or Teacher Cha, only for it to obviously turn out to be Kyungran, which again, it still feels weird they continuously talk about her as this scary person, when again, she just feels largely affable. But either way, we get to the main match reveal, which ends up being Layoff, a modification of Food Chain, but instead of animals, we're in the setting of a office, and it contains office workers and executives, and this just sucks. I mean, straight up, I just think this is terrible. I really just don't get why they just didn't do Food Chain 2. I mean, I think what makes Food Chain very effective of the game is just how simple it is to learn. Again, it is very easy to follow Food Chain, considering you obviously inherently know where these animals fit on the food chain, and through that makes it easier to understand. While I feel like with Layoff, it's just a very confusing game. I think it's very just difficult to understand what roles do what roles have precedent over each other. But even beyond that, there's modifications made to this game that I simply just don't like. Or they do add in a salary system, of that being the determining factor on whether or not the executives end up winning, taking out this necessity to kill one per round, which again felt like this nice balance for the Predators, and then potentially being screwed by being in a room with the wrong people, though I feel like that kind of just gets minimized with this game. And obviously just in general, it feels like a smaller scaled game with less players, one less room, and again, just as a whole, was just kind of hard to follow, with a feeling like the show even recognized that, with the show constantly having to bring up the Food Chain counterpart to put in context what these other roles are. Wait, we get another rehearsal, which is just another pretty boring sequence where really nothing of note really happens here outside of Sungyu and Sangmin drawing the workplace couple, which is kind of humorous. But then we get to the real draw, where really this is where this episode goes even further downhill, as right away we see the season 1 alliance essentially getting all of the stronger roles here, and through that work together to formulate a plan that really ends up making the rest of the game just kind of boring, as obviously the season 1 people are going to win. But it is also funny that we do see Junghoon getting a pretty decent role here, to where he's excited and can't leave the room yet, as he constantly laughs and is surging with happiness, to where he leaves the room with a frown and starts jogging around the set, which is all this really ridiculous Junghoon moment, but one that once we get to the game itself obviously gets turned into this big dodo moment for him. But it is here where we finally see Junghoon now agreeing to work together with the other players to flush out the token of immortality, which it makes you question again, why didn't you do this last round? And it just feels a bit too late now, especially with the season 1 people helping out Sangmin. Though it does also make you question how broken this game is in the fact that there technically was a chance that everyone could have had safety here, where because there was this random draw for rolls, there's very much a chance that all 5 of the real players could have drawn rolls that he could have gotten their winning conditions with. And even beyond that, obviously adding in the token of immortality, it really just leads to this being potential train wreck, though obviously doesn't come to that. Here, another change, one that is probably for the better, is that not everyone gets to peek at another player, where only HR is able to do so. Though it is through this that we find out that Yo-won is listed as CEO Kim, though through a later conversation that is pretty awkward between him and Jung-moon, and him just in general coming off pretty sketchy here. Him later trying to put the chameleon role onto Sangmin, who they learn is Director Lee, pretty much the best role you can get in this game. I think it should have made it pretty clear that Yo-won was probably the chameleon. But anyway, we finally get to the actual game itself, where right away we see Sangmin firing Jung-hyun, again being this humorous dodo moment for him, who was again so happy with his role. And this is where it is revealed that Sangmin is actually Director Lee, and with that he essentially just wins. Where you flash back to season 1 people really just orchestrating this entire game, having fully plotted out really everything in a way that would allow for all 7 of them to end up winning together, which is just, again, just kind of lame. But it's also during this sequence where we get the reveal that Jung-moon is pretending that she has power, only for it to actually be an intern, which leads to a funny round 2 of Ji-won being scared of Jung-moon and constantly is confused over why she isn't killing him. Whereas also here where Yo-won gets called out for being the chameleon due to Yurim being the prince who knows the role of CEO Kim, and that being Chang-yop, again, another position where the season 1 group just draws the perfect roles here, though also this is a pretty bad move from Yo-won, the fact that he did pick CEO Kim to be the person that he impersonated when there is a person that will always know the real CEO Kim. So I don't know why he went with that route, but this obviously leads to him being fired by Sangmin there. But then we get to round 3, where Sangmin is then in a room with Yu Young and Ji-won, who he does talk about as being his 2 targets for the round, wanting to split them up as this powerful duo in the game. And what do you know? He kills Yu Young, taking her out of the game, with Yu Young seeming to be his main target here as the one that he looks as the most threatening of the bunch, which to be fair is probably true. So again, it just kind of sets up this easy outcome for the episode that makes it pretty clear that she's in danger here. But then we finally get some intrigue here from the start of round 4, where Chang-yop realizes that he's miscalculated, and the fact that there needs to be another sacrifice in order for everyone else to win, where they agree on killing Jun-suk, with Jun-suk having the least amount of connections with the rest of them. However, it's then revealed that Jun-suk did not go according to their plan, going into an opposite room, which means because of that, Sangmin now needs to kill Chang-yop in order for him to survive, causing this complete breakdown of their plan, without Chang-yop and Yurim not being declared winners. While Jun-suk's move here makes him a winner, so we do get some awkwardness from him and Yurim being in the room together, despite the fact that the move that Jun-suk just did, screwing Yurim over. This ends up being a pretty notable moment for Jun-suk, I think being this moment that really solidified his spot on Grand Final, with this kind of showing that Jun-suk does have this potential in the game, the fact that he is a pretty strategic figure that is willing to make these cutthroat moves here and go against the grain. But with that, we do have Jun-suk, Kyungran, Sungyu, and Jung-moon as the winners, alongside the real players in Sangmin and Ji-won, with them getting to decide who goes into the death match. However, Ji-won just relents all that responsibility on the Sangmin, to which he ends up picking Yu Young, which is, again, kind of a questionable move from Ji-won to be letting Yu Young go here. Obviously his closest ally on the board, but here we do see Yu Young having to pick between Jung-hyun and Yo-won, with her picking Jung-hyun because he has more garnets. Once again, showing Yo-won's strategy coming into effect here. But with that, we get a new deathmatch here, one of my personal favorites, in that being black and white. It's a pretty simple game of each player being given numbered tiles and must secretly present one every round, with the even tiles being black while the odd tiles are white, allowing you to deduce what tiles are being used during each round, as they're kept a secret throughout the entire game, and the person that ends up presenting the highest number tile ends up winning each matchup, or the person that has the most points by the end ends up winning. Again, I personally really like this game. I've played this game numerous times. I just personally find it kind of fun. Now again, it is still a relatively basic game, and one that there are only a few routes you can take with your approach to the game, though as a whole I still find it to be a fun game nonetheless. Though here we see it play out in a pretty baseline way, where really both of them end up using the pretty basic strat here of using your lower numbers first and saving your bigger numbers for the end, which results in a tie, which is just kind of boring, especially when we have them replaying it in the exact same way, though Jung-hoon's barely able to get a lead above her, to which he ends up winning here, which with that we lose Yu-young, who, I've said this in the past, I still stick by this, I think Yu-young's probably the best female player of the Genius, where, well, again, she's still not perfect. I do still feel like she has moments of her just sticking with the baseline and her also having some pretty poor social play at points. I do feel like she is able to pretty much match Kyungran and being the strong force during main matches that's able to be part of these majority groups and be one of the more active strategic thinkers. However, I do feel like Yu-young, in my mind, plays a lot more individualistically, where I feel like there are a lot more points where I can call out Yu-young for playing the game to her best interest. And while there are definitely points where she does get outplayed by others, I do feel like, for me, my always criticism of Kyungran is that I always feel like she's playing for other people, not necessarily herself. While I feel like Yu-young does typically play for herself and does end up building some pretty strong one-on-one bonds that does keep her safe throughout the game. Again, she literally has Ji-won betraying Doohee in this really over-the-top way for the sake of saving her. So I've always personally found Yu-young to be one of the more impressive players in the history of the show, and certainly one of the best female players the show has ever had. But now for episode 10, an episode that I remember really not liking the first time I watched this season. However, I think as more time goes on, the more and more I grow on it, where I actually think it has a pretty interesting main match in particular, though I'm a bit more mixed on certain other aspects of the episode. Before we get to that, we do start off the episode with a pretty humorous exchange of Jung-hoon, again, now being so resolute and wanting Sangmin to go into the death match, which again, kind of too late, especially considering the fact this is the final time that Sangmin can use the token of immortality, which really just shows you how much they've blown that opportunity. But then we get the later reveal that this is going to be another guest round. How surprisingly not guest picked by the players themselves, being the only time that doesn't happen in the show's run. But instead, the guests here end up being members of Super Junior, which I guess is this boy band group, and they're kind of boring for the most part, where you do get Shindong, who is a great character, one that I did very much enjoy in this episode. However, all the other ones don't really do much for me, and I do feel like that ends up being a bit of a knock for this episode in my mind. It's just how dull the other Super Junior members are. But either way, we get to the main match, which is revealed to be the Big Deal game, a game where a Genius player and a Super Junior member are going to be paired up. However, the Super Junior member will not know who their partner is, though we'll get 5 million won if they do win. So obviously gives them incentive there, though funnily it's 5 times the amount that the season 1 players got for the previous episode, which I did find funny. Though the game is played by each player being randomly given 2 out of 5 colors, and each player will be given 3 rounds, of which they are given a combination of colors that they must negotiate with others in order to get those colors and divvy out these points, and with partners sharing points, it obviously leads to this importance of having to work with your partner and having your partner trust you in order to increase your pool. Though another interesting aspect of this game is the fact that you can also cancel your deal and just get the baseline level of points, which really balances out this concept of these rarer colors costing more, where it makes it so that you do very much have to balance out these negotiations, not going really hard and wanting a specific number. That adds a lot more nuance to this game. Though at the same time, I do feel like there's a lot of luck involved in this game, particularly in the colors that you draw, along the fact of what colors you need for your round and also how many points it's worth. Again, I do feel like there's a lot of randomness in that, which I don't love. Though again, I still feel like as a whole, I do really like this main match. I do feel like it's one that just leads to a lot of interesting dynamics with the players, again, having to negotiate with each other, which is just typically fun to see. Though first we do get a rehearsal, which is just, again, kind of bland, though we obviously get to spend some time with the Super Junior players, who, again, are just kind of bland in themselves, where I also find it very difficult to follow who is partnered with who here, where for some reason the profile pictures that they use for these players don't look anything like how they look in real life, with one of them even having like a different hair color than their profile picture, which is just really weird. Though this does also set up the Jung-hoon Yo-won dynamic that ends up having really humorous results across this episode. Then we get the real partners being picked, to where we get a lot of focus on Shindong and him trying to find his partner, with Jung-hoon telling him him that he's his partner and him being disappointed that he has Jung-hoon, which is humorous. But we also get a lot of talk about him wanting to be on the Genie Season 3, which again is a shock to me that he wasn't, and he feels like he would have been a very easy pick. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if he wanted to and they couldn't work out the scheduling with him, though I always felt like he seemed pretty poised for a return, especially considering how important he ends up being to this episode. Well, in this video, we also get Ji-won and Sang-min telling their respective partners, to which neither of them end up believing them, which is funny. But then we get the drawing for the colors, where Jung-hoon and Yeowon are the only two people to draw blue, to which they end up forming the Blue Cartel, which again is this deal of them trying to keep the cost of blue very high, which doesn't last. But this is where we finally get the reveal of the actual partners, where it turns out that Yeowon and Jung-hoon are working together even more so than just that, having created a plan to work together by giving points to each other's partners, wanting to keep each other's partners a secret from the other players and the partners themselves, though I really don't get why. I mean, I get the importance of keeping a secret from the other Genius players, but again, the keeping it secret from your own partner just seemed kind of misguided there. But here we also see Yeowon create another plan here to benefit his alliance, of this plan of selling the other colors outside of blue for only 1 point to avoid everyone else from getting points for those colors, while still allowing Yeowon and Jung-moon to make a lot of money off of blue, to which it should put them in the lead. And along the way, we still get a few humorous moments here and there, from Shin-dong getting annoyed at Sang-min betting him down, to where he ends up bidding back up to 4 from 2. We also get Sang-min, Sang-min's partner, picking Ji-won over him. Eventually, we do have Sang-min and Ji-won getting to talk, to where they talk about having to split up the other two, only for them to do it themselves. Where in round 2, we see Jung-hoon and Yeowon essentially getting to a bidding war, with Jung-hoon continuously bidding Yeowon down, going against their plan. And also even later, Jung-hoon doesn't take points from Shin-dong as they intended as well, which leads to Yeowon now realizing that if Jung-hoon does win the death match, obviously Sang-min is going to use the token of immortality on himself, which will mean that Yeowon is automatically going to elimination anyway, to which he now realizes that he needs to bid 1 on every blue to make sure that Jung-hoon doesn't win, which leads to pretty humorous results, again being this really funny feud between the two here. But also it leads to Sang-min and Yeowon finally getting to talk once again, to where Yeowon wants to make a deal with Sang-min for him to save him with the token of immortality if he helps him win the main match, which is essentially what we end up seeing happening, where Sang-min ends up getting into a massive lead, which really just ends up summing up the entirety of this season, all while Jung-hoon and his partner are safe for last, and through that get propped up as them having a chance to win the game, though obviously they don't, and Sang-min and Sung-min win here. Though this is also where we get a reveal from Shin-dong in the fact that he had actually made deals with the other Super Junior members, to where he gets 1 million won if they end up winning, being this fun little moment for him, though otherwise, Yeowon is the actual loser of the match here and does end up picking Jung-hoon. However, then we get the reveal from Sang-min that he's going to use the token on Yeowon, a plan that he actually had from the very beginning, saying that he always planned on using it on Yeowon if he ever was in danger, flashing back to even the day that he ends up finding the token, where we get this interview from him saying that he's going to use it on Yeowon, making this seem like a genuine thing, despite the fact that we constantly see Sang-min and Yeowon arguing over those weeks as well. But this ends up being a nice payoff to this relationship here. Obviously, this pretty hostile relationship for most of the season, though again, nice to see Sang-min pay him back in this instance. But due to him using the token on Yeowon, that means Ji-won is instantly his replacement, to where he goes against Jung-hoon, which I will say, as much as this is a great storyline moment for Yeowon and Sang-min, and I understand that Sang-min is again hyping this up for the show, and that he wants this to be a big storyline, which is Sang-min for you, I do feel like it is a pretty solid move from a game standpoint, where, again, Yeowon is for sure his biggest threat at the end of the game, probably being the best 1v1 competitor left in the game, and for him to sacrifice Ji-won and Jung-hoon, these two people who are more likely to be working with him down the road, and also just lesser threats in death matches, I do feel like it is a pretty misguided move, though it obviously doesn't end up biting him by the end of it. But here we do see the death match end up being Indian Hold'em once again, which is just kind of boring, though we do end up having another pretty humorous dodo moment for Jung-hoon of him wanting them to cut the deck, and we also see him trying to hold the card sideways and try to look up at what his card is, which is all pretty humorous content. Though, I mean, Jung-hoon really ends up being in the lead for most of this challenge here, and after them both going all in at a point where Jung-hoon had a 2, but Ji-won had a 1, it leaves the score at 80 versus 2. So obviously at that point, Jung-hoon ends up winning there, being a pretty funny downfall for Ji-won, the fact that he ends up losing in the same game that he beat Jin-ho in, while also continuing this pretty impressive streak for Jung-hoon, him having won 3 eliminations in a row, which is pretty unexpected from him. But with that, we obviously lose Ji-won, who is a pretty big character across this season, and also a pretty solid player. Now again, I mean, there's multiple points across the season where he does get outplayed, and he does seem to really struggle beyond the initial strategy, though I do think he is a pretty solid player in terms of survival. I do think he has this solid instinct of doing what he needs to in order to keep himself safe, whether that means finding the right groups to work alongside, though I do feel like he is still not the greatest mean match competitor in the world, and even deathmatch wise, he really wins by complete luck against Jin-ho, and Young-kyo win was more so an anti-Young-kyo sentiment than him really doing anything too impressive on his own right, but I do think he's still a pretty solid player all around, and one that does have, again, a decent amount of humorous moments throughout this season, to where he ends up being one of the more notable newbies on this season in my mind. But now for episode 11, the final 3 episode, where this ends up being a somewhat unique episode in the fact that we do get more guests, though these guests end up being players from this season, where we get 3 eliminated players coming back, that being Jin-ho, Doohee, and Dahae, which I will say, considering future returning seasons, this did feel like a random grouping of people. This does lead to some interesting back and forth between the players, particularly between Jin-ho and Yo-hwan. Obviously, they directly play into the main match, that being the elevator game, a game where they will now be teamed up with the 3 players still in the game working together and the 3 players that came back working together. To where each team has 1 piece on this board that they must move across, to where the first person that reaches number 100 ends up winning, and the way they move is by each individual player pushing 1 or 0, where the sum of the numbers you push ends up amounting to the number of spaces you move. Though along the way you can obviously land on elevators that will move your piece up or down, where the way that the genius players end up winning immunity here is through placing markers on different spots around the board, where if a piece lands on that marker, that player will end up getting a point, and the person with the most points at the end ends up winning. All this a really interesting game, a game that has these 2 sides, that overall being a very interesting game, obviously being in line with these games we've seen in the past that allow for betrayal across sides, and really just playing into Sangmin's wheelhouse here of the type of game that he obviously really excels in. And we instantly do see right away that Yo-won and Sangmin are both talking about how they're going to play for themselves and try to give themselves the win, all while Jung-hoon is giving this inspirational speech about how they should get the money, which is all funny. Which I should also mention that the prize for winning this game for the genius players are that they do get 20 million won added to the prize pool, which would have made it more than season 1's, though obviously that doesn't end up happening, and through that they end up being significantly lower than season 1's, while otherwise the Revenger team will get 2 million won for each player that was already eliminated, which was weird. That's how they handled this, to give out money to people that weren't even there. But either way, again, like, I do feel like this game just kind of plays off exactly how you would expect it to, of Sangmin betraying his team, going to the other side, and at the last second he decides to flip back, only for that to not work to his favor. Again, it's this formula we've seen numerous times before. I mean, this is literally exactly what we saw in Kong's Dilemma in season 1. And again, I just felt like it was even more incentivized for that to happen, considering the fact that, again, really the genius team themselves have almost no incentive to fully work together here, despite being paired up as a team. Where the Revenger team was always going to be this team that was more cohesive in their overall goals, and there was always going to be a genius player that would have flipped over, and through that, I kind of felt like it nullified the entire purpose of the game itself. Even though, again, I still think it made for good TV here, and even Jin-ho openly says that in the episode, with him even fully talking about how it's not going to be difficult for them to win. And again, I think just in general, I would have personally preferred if this was probably like a Final 6 game, and kind of in the light of Kong's Dilemma, or at least at that point, there's a lot more individualistic gameplay there, there's a lot more reason to be working with the other side, and there'll be both sides trying to work with each other instead of just a one-sided battle. And I think just in general that would have been my personal preference there. But anyway, we do see them selecting their spots, where Yo-won ends up getting a lot of the top spots, which is the optimal play there, as obviously that is the spot where you're more than likely going to continuously get bumped down before eventually making it through. That is, unless you obviously have the game gamed like Sangmin did. But anyway, we do get some funny interactions between the players before the game actually starts, where we do get Jin-ho talking about how embarrassing it was to see Yo-won begging during the minus auction, which I will say, the fact that they are erasing the minus auction essentially means that there was only a 3-week gap in between filming and airing, which is extremely short. I'm really impressed that they were able to put together these episodes in that short amount of time. But we do have Doohee talking about how impressed he is of Jung-hoon's recent deathmatch wins, only for Jung-hoon to then get more Dodo content, which was a fun dichotomy there. We see this conversation between Dahae and Yeowon, where Yeowon asks for her help, only for her to say that she likes him but hasn't liked his last few episodes, which really ends up being the end of Yeowon's attempts to work with the other side, which ends up feeling extremely misguided, obviously, as we do see Sangmin going all in on this later in the episode. Either way, once the game actually starts, it ends up being pretty straightforward. I mean, there isn't too much that goes out of the norm here. I mean, we do start off with a pretty interesting round, I guess, where we do see the Genius team agreeing on a plan, only for Sangmin to decide to go against it because he realizes it's not in his best interest, only for it to turn out that Yeowon was lying about it to begin with, which is a minor moment of Yeowon outplaying him there, with Yeowon obviously wanting to get towards the top of the map, as he obviously has most of his markers at the top of the map. But either way, the Revenger team obviously gets a massive lead, as you would expect, with Jung-hoon getting worked up and starts running around, which ends up being this notable moment. But obviously we eventually get the reveal that Sangmin has been helping out the Revengers, with him having been giving them signals to tell him what to do, ranging from hitting his head to dancing to pleading please, 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 which all this is just kind of ridiculous. It's once again obviously Sangmin just hamming it up for a show, but you obviously could have made signals that weren't this over the top. But we do get Sangmin talking about how his head hurts now from banging it so much, which is funny. But either way, we eventually do see the other players catching on to that something is off here, to where Jung-hoon ends up telling the other side to put in their votes first, which for some reason seemed to be this one round thing where it seems like after this they should continue to play the game as normal, which was just really weird. Though once we get towards the end of the game, obviously the Revengers realize that Sangmin's going to betray them, so they end up sticking to their own plan. Again, exactly what we've seen from Sangmin in the past. Though here we do see Jinho tricking Yeowon into thinking that they picked 0 when they went with 3, which ends up leading to their win here, and Sangmin ends up getting the immunity as the person that got the most points on the board, essentially being obviously this end of Sangmin's main match winning streak, with him having won 8 main matches on this season, which is ridiculous. And again, while some of those were definitely handed to him through him getting extremely fortunate with certain roles, I do feel like as a whole, I mean, this was still a really insane stretch for him, especially considering, again, like, this is also technically a win. And it's not declared a main match win. It's more so the Revengers being the winners and him getting immunity, though again, I would classify this as a win as well, which if you take that into account, he essentially wins all but 2 games. But with that, we obviously get to the death match, which is automatically going to be Jung-hoon versus Yeowon, which ends up being the return of Black and White. To which, coming in this, we get a montage of Jung-hoon's deathmatch victories, which should have made it very clear that Yeowon was going to win. But he doesn't just win here, he really ends up decimating Jung-hoon in what ends up being one of my favorite death matches in the history of the show here, with us seeing a lot of this from Jung-hoon's perspective, where, again, he really just ends up playing the same strat he used in the previous game, which I don't get why he did, considering he barely won over Yu Young. But here we see Yeowon create strategy to completely counter that, using his higher tiles at the very beginning, which through that, and also Jung-hoon still having his 0 and his 1 by the end of the game, it really just leads to an easy victory for Yeowon here, again, completely outplaying Jung-hoon in this situation, really showing Yeowon's perpetuity for death matches here. And that, again, I do feel like in terms of 1v1 battles, I do think Yeowon is one of the best in the show, really getting the strategic aspects of these death matches, probably the best out of most people that have played the game. But with that, obviously we do lose Jung-hoon, who I personally find to be a really fun character on this season. Again, his entire arc on this season is just really humorous, to where he is instantly discounted as this pretty big dodo figure that didn't really know what he was doing. And to be fair, I do think that is kind of the truth, though he obviously has this massive uptick towards the end of the game, though he really ends up finding himself in a good position kind of despite that. And by the mid portion of the game, again, he is winning these death matches for 3 rounds in a row. And while you could definitely say that he lucks his way to the final 3, I did find his overall run this season to be humorous on that light, but also even beyond that, he's just a fun character. Again, I do find him to be one of the more entertaining people to have played the Genius, with, again, the dodo edit that he gets here just being super funny, but also mixing that in with how the other players treat him. Again, I just personally find him to be a really fun character here. But with that, that finally takes us to the finale, which I'm just very mixed on the finale as a whole. I mean, it feels like a better finale than season 1, the fact that obviously there was more competition, where obviously we come down to the final game and it is extremely close at the very end. However, I do feel like the games themselves here were just extremely underwhelming, adding a major luck factor to the game that I just feel like made the overall outcome here a bit underwhelming, even though the actual result is one that definitely makes sense for the season. But with that, we do start off, as every finale does, with the two standing in front of the table to where we get flashbacks to their relationship, which, I mean, unlike the Jinho Kyungran one from season 1, this one at least made a bit more sense with Sangmin and Yeohwan having this big rivalry across this season, though also had this weird camaraderie as well, with obviously the focus around the token fiasco. And it's also felt like this very fitting ending to this season. Have, one of the best mean match competitors in the history of the show versus one of the best death match competitors in the history of the show. Again, having Sangmin, this massive overdog in the game, versus Yeohwan, this massive underdog in the game. Being these two complete opposite approaches to playing the game that I think made this final here to be really interesting, though at the same time, again, just kind of underwhelmed with how exactly things play out here. But either way, we obviously then see the eliminated players coming in to where you do get the funny moment of Jung-hoon complaining about his edit and why they always play this weird music when he's there alone, along the fact that he also proposes setting up this alumni meetup twice a year, which I'm sure that happened. Obviously, the eliminated players here are here to dole out advantages like last time, though first they get to talk to the final two, which these typically don't ever bring anything that interesting and don't really seem to sway that many people's opinions. But again, a nice little addition there. Also here we do see that Jae-kyung is not there, being the only person to not appear for the final here, though thankfully unlike last time where, again, I complained the fact that the people that didn't end up showing up to the final seemed to just pick a person to hand out their globe for them, but not tell them exactly who to give it to. This time, we do see Jae-kyung specifically tell Hongchul to give it to Yeohwan, which definitely made that a bit better, though in terms of the actual distribution here, Yeohwan gets most of the earlier boots, aka the non-celebs, in Huijong, Dahae, Yoon-sung, and also gets Hongchul, surprisingly. Though to be fair, they always seem to have a pretty close relationship. Though again, Hongchul really hams this up on the show, saying that he's voting for Yeohwan to prove that there's no celeb versus celeb battle. It talks about how it was all in the editing, which is funny that this actually makes the show, considering this is definitely a moment that on Survivor, Jeff Probst would be extremely pissed off about someone saying this. But also we do get content from Dahae talking about how she's voting for Yeohwan because he was the first to text her after she got eliminated, which I think does show you Yeohwan playing up this like jury management angle with the genius. Now, to be fair, I think he's also probably just a nice guy that genuinely reached out, though it is interesting to see him getting these votes from players like Dahae and Jae-kyung because he was just simply nicer to them. While we then get to Sangmin, who gets the votes from Hyunkyo, who feels sorry for him, which is just a weird thing to say about Sangmin. I guess it was because the first 3 votes were all Yeohwan votes, though to be fair, I did feel like a couple of the Sangmin votes here came from the fact that he had less garnets, and considering the rule of the person with the most garnets ends up getting an extra advantage, I feel like they wanted to kind of even things out, which I'll also say kind of humorous that Yeohwan ends up coming into the final with the most garnets, considering his 0 garnet run for most of the season. But either way, we have both Doohee and Jinho voting for Sangmin, talking about how he's the most genius-like, which I will say Doohee's vote in particular is kind of surprising, especially considering Sangmin's role in getting him out and how personally hurt he was in that. But also Yu Young ends up voting for Sangmin, which is also a little bit of a surprise considering Yu Young's close relationship with Yeohwan. And we do get Jiwon fondly voting for Sangmin, saying that everything Hongchul said was a lie. But then we get the Jung-hoon, who once again just hams up his vote, saying he doesn't want to vote for anybody, but ends up voting for Sangmin, as again, Yeohwan will end up getting the extra advantage due to the garnets. But with that, we also get the introduction to the final rules, which are exactly the same as last time. It is a best out of 3 in death matches, with the middle death match being played being a new game, while the other 2 have been pre-selected, though the order will be determined by Yeohwan here, as he ended up getting that advantage, which, to be fair, is not that big of an advantage, which really just in general, Yeohwan ends up getting kind of screwed over in terms of the advantages that he gets, where he doesn't really get any particularly good ones, while Sangmin seemed to get all the good advantages here, which greatly benefited him here. But either way, the 2 games that they have to pick through are Indian Hold'em and Quattro for some reason. To where Yeohwan, being a poker player, ends up picking Indian Hold'em to be his first game. And Indian Hold'em ends up just kind of being boring, with Yeohwan clearly winning from the beginning, and Sangmin just kind of struggling throughout all this being the only time we see Sangmin even play in a poker-style game, but again, he just really does not perform particularly well. And he does also waste one of his advantages really early on here, using a copier to get 5 extra chips, which just felt like a massive waste. Like, what's 5 chips gonna do for you? Especially considering, like, by the end of it, like, Sangmin just seems to kind of give up, kind of acknowledging the fact that Yeohwan's gonna win, with Yeohwan playing pretty conservatively and also counting cards, and really just, again, never felt in doubt there. But then we get to game 2, which ends up being the new game, that game being Truth Detector. A really, really bad game. A game that is just so dull, as is essentially each player having to create a 4-digit password and then take turns in asking each other questions about the password, which for some reason they must respond with a lie, which just seemed to overcomplicate everything here. But also, if you tell the truth, you must reveal one of your numbers as a penalty, which again, that's never going to happen. Also, here you're not allowed to ask evasive questions or impossible questions, which is like, why would you ask them? Why is that even technically a rule? It's like, again, you're trying to find the specific code. It's like, why would you ask them an impossible question? That's just wasting a turn. But just overall, this is a really bad game. I mean, this is just a game that is so gameable. I mean, Simon creates the basic strategy right off the bat of doing a binary search. And while we see Yoan going for a more unique approach, it's simply just not the optimal strategy. Where, again, there are ways for it to lead to a win, but it would be very luck dependent. While just Sangman's strategy of just doing a binary search is just the optimal path to take here, which just makes this entirely boring and just really a lame game, as it's really a game that makes you incentivized to not think outside the box. Which makes this even more funny, the fact that they actually used this as the final game for the Genius Netherlands, the game to decide the winner, which is just so stupid. But also right away, we see obviously both players realize that they can't use repeating numbers, as that will make things too obvious, to which Sangman then uses a year, which also should have been too obvious, but he picks 1928, the birth year of his father, which leads to some personal content for Sangman. Though again, we see Yoan taking this really high-risk strategy here, a strategy that ends up leading to a lot of confusion from the other players, with them just laughing at his questions, asking about the sum of the two lowest numbers, and later asking about the product of them, and asking if the lowest numbers connect. And while this seems like an insane strategy at first, he actually is able to get the numbers eventually. Now, he does make 2 wrong guesses, though his second guess ends up containing all the right numbers, though just in the wrong order. And to some that seemed to be stemming from the fact that he seemed to not recognize the fact that both the front 2 and the back 2 can amount to the same sum, which I think messed him up in having 28 at the beginning instead of the end. Though really at that point where you see the numbers 1 and 9, I feel like you should have expected that was probably a year. But anyway, this obviously ends up not working in Yoan's favor, especially once Sangman uses his double at the very end, where he ends up easily winning there, taking us to the final game, that being Quattro. It's Quattro determining the entire winner of the season, which is just so lame, as again, it's such a luck-dependent game, and this version actually is even worse than the original version, where for me, the original version, while it is very luck dependent, there is at least some game to it, and the fact that you obviously have to use your social bonds and coordinate on how to send signals to each other, and I felt like that at least made that somewhat interesting. While here, they end up making major modifications to the OG format that, again, do make it slightly more fair, especially in this pretense where, again, the number of backers that these two players have is uneven, but just makes it even more random. Now, again, there were some good additions here, like the ability to mulligan your cards twice. Also, the addition of the 0 card can now complete in Quattro instead of making an automatic loss. Again, there's still aspects I don't like. The fact that the other players are not in the room and through that cannot make signals to each other. Also, we have the finalists only being able to look at one specific player's hands, which just adds so much randomness to it. And the fact that they're simply not going to know what the other players have, which, to be fair, the original Quattro had no peeking at all, but again, at least at that point, they could signal to each other what cards they had. Well, this just takes a lot of skill out of it. Also, beyond that, we have the announcement that they can only trade with 3 people, which, again, makes sense. Again, there aren't an even number of backers here, where Sangman ends up having more backers in person there than Yoan, though it also just makes it, again, that much more random. The fact that you have to entirely bank your entire Quattro on 3 people that you don't even know what cards they have. And also another aspect of this I did not particularly like are the advantages that were doled out here, where, to be fair, a lot of this is just unlucky circumstances with Yoan in particular, where, to be fair, Yoan gets a pretty powerful advantage here in an additional trade, though Sangman still has the Disabler, which essentially nullifies his advantage here, while Sangman has probably the most powerful advantage of them all, that being a forced 0. Giving him a much easier path to a win, essentially making it that if he gets 3 different colors, which is not that hard to do here, he essentially is guaranteed a Quattro, which again, to get all 4 colors is really where all the difficulty comes from here. especially for Yoan, who's even screwed over even more so in the fact that he also has less opportunities to have different colors here, where, again, while every player can only switch 3 times, again, Yoan has less people to be able to switch with, which obviously gives him less odds in having cards that end up benefiting him. So again, all this just felt like Yoan just getting massively screwed over by this game here. And we do instantly see Yoan talking about all he cares about is getting a Quattro, as straight up, again, getting a Quattro in this version of the game is just extremely difficult to begin with and extremely luck dependent. Though we once again see Yoan going out of the norm here in checking for Doohie's cards instead of someone that actually backed him, which is a bit of a surprise, though it really doesn't end up benefiting him really at all. Also, we see Sangmin picking Junghoon to where he recognizes that Junghoon has all green cards, being of no help to Sangmin as he already has a green 10, though this play into his later win, where we obviously have the game play out with Yoan picking Yu Young to switch with initially, which is a bit of a surprise as well, though at the same time, it really is the last 2 switches that seem to matter more so, which he does save for his actual allies in Dahe and Yunsung, as those will really be the switches that determine whether or not you're able to complete your Quattro. But really, it all comes down to Yoan needing a green card, him having every other color, and him saving Yunsung for last, only for the reveal that she doesn't have one. Which, again, Sangmin realized that he was in a good spot through noticing that Junghoon had mostly green cards, where with him also having green cards, it made it very unlikely that Yoan was going to be able to complete the Quattro here. So he obviously ends up failing in doing so, and Sangmin is declared the winner. Again, a satisfying conclusion to this season, obviously, for Sangmin, the greatest character, quite possibly in all of reality television, but also a player that completely outplayed really the entire field during main matches. For that person to win is a satisfying conclusion, though again, I'm still underwhelmed with the way he does win. Where this has always been my criticism of Sangmin as a player is the fact that I do feel like his overall deathmatch ability is just straight up pretty bad, where again, the 2 matches he wins here in his entire Genius career are Truth Detector and Quattro. Truth Detector, again, a game where he just simply plays the baseline strategy, and Quattro, a game that is entirely based around luck. While he fails in these more skill-based death matches, I really just feel like his overall win here on this season was kind of just a fluke, in him getting these really bad death matches that ended up kind of favoring him, where it is kind of underwhelming that he wins in this fashion here, though obviously he's the perfect representative for the Genius, this perfect player to be added to the very small pool of winners that we have for this show, and through that kind of makes it feel a bit better despite that. But anyway, with that, let's talk about the 2 finalists, starting off with Yoan, who again I thought was a pretty fun character. I really liked his underdog run of him actively playing from the bottom and him having 0 garnets and him essentially having to plead for his life despite the fact that he came into this season being this big overdog, being called the Emperor, and then being this big foil for Jinho. And the fact that his run in the season ends up playing out in the complete opposite way is really humorous. But also, I feel like he's probably the most unlucky player in the Genius, probably the player that was the closest to winning in my mind out of the players to not win. And along with him having these really innovative strategies and him really outplaying everyone that he faced off against in one-on-one matches, I do feel like Yoan is a very strong Genius competitor. And while that doesn't really get backed up in Grand Final, and to be fair, his weakness has always been his subpar main match ability, I do feel like he's a player that I would probably have more faith in on any given season than someone like Sangmin, just due to the fact that I would have much more confidence in his overall deathmatch ability, while he's not entirely bad at main matches either. But also beyond that, I also felt like he was a pretty fun character, proving to be this pretty fun foil for a lot of the people around him through his usage of unique strategies. Again, he has this weird rivalry with Junghoon and with Sangmin, and he obviously had this built-in relation with Jinho, and I feel like just as a whole, like I found them to be pretty entertaining on this season, which is another reason why I do hold this season still in pretty high regard. To our characters like Yoan, despite him being very game body, is still able to bring some entertainment along the way. But with that, let's obviously get to the winner in Sangmin, who again, I still think is one of the greatest reality TV characters of all time. I think his run on this season is probably one of the greatest runs for any individual player in the history of reality TV. Again, he just simply dominates this season. Again, well, all that when actually analyzing things does feel very luck dependent with certain roles that he was given, and again, this overall final here being one that he really does end up lucking out here. I do feel like as a whole, especially when it comes to the main match portion of it, he does just simply outplay everyone most of the time. I mean, he is by far one of the best main match competitors in the history of the show. It's just a shame that it doesn't translate to death matches, but even then, again, I think considering his legacy on the show, considering how great a TV he is, along with how good he is at main matches, I think him winning here was definitely the best outcome for the season. I think it allows him to be etched as one of the biggest names in the history of the game. It allows for him to be in the talks with Jinho and Dongmin as these all-time greats from the show, which feels right considering how much of an impact he has on these first 2 seasons. And really just some of the reveals revolving him in this season are some of my favorites in the history of the show. Again, the flashbacks during God's Judgment and obviously the entire storyline around the Token of Immortality are all just such great moments for Sangmin that really elevate him as one of the greatest characters of all time. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire season of The Genius, Season 2, Rule Breakers, a season that I still personally really enjoy. While I do definitely see more of its downsides on the rewatch here, particularly that endgame stretch, which I don't think is the most interesting in the world. And I do think as a whole, this is probably the weakest cast of the show from a gameplay perspective. I still think this is one of the most entertaining casts for me personally. Again, you have the likes of Sangmin, Hongchul, Junghoon, Yohwan, who are all incredible characters in my eyes. You have the return of Jinho, who has this interesting arc. Doohyee's downfall is great. Guizhong's downfall. And there's so many great storylines across this season where I can understand the criticism over the celeb versus non-celeb dynamic and the focus around the Token of Immortality and how certain main matches were just dumbly designed, which I at least agree with that sentiment for sure. But I still think as a whole, this ended up being a really fun season. To be honest, kind of despite of itself, I do feel like it's a season that I can understand why people look at it as the worst Genius season. However, for me personally, I just always had a lot of reverence for it and always found it to be my personal favorite, even though I can see technically that especially the next 2 seasons are better when you're truly analyzing them. But either way, those are my thoughts on the Genius Rule Breakers. Now, moving forward, I do still plan on continuing these retrospectives for seasons 3 and 4 during their respective anniversaries, so stay tuned for those down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.